Introduction of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. Introduction. The history of the Letters of Dante from the 14th century to the present day. That Dante was the author of numerous letters, some of which were in nature of political manifestos, while others were more or less concerned with his own personal interests, we know from various sources. In the first place we have Dante's own testimony in Vita Nuova, where he refers to a letter which he says he addressed to the principal personages of the city of Florence after the death of Beatrice, which took place on the evening of June 8, 1290. He quotes the beginning of this letter, Quo modo sedet sola civitas, but excuses himself for not transcribing more than the opening words, on the ground that the letter was in Latin, and it was not his intention to include in the Vita Nuova anything that was not written in the vulgar tongue. The earliest independent testimony is that furnished by two of Dante's contemporaries, namely the astrologer poet Francesco degli Stabili, better known as Cecco d'Ascoli, who was burned as a free thinker at Florence 6 years after Dante's death, and the chronicler Giovanni Villani, who was Dante's neighbour in Florence, and, as his nephew Filippo records, was a personal friend of the poet. Patrus meus Johannes Villani Hystericus, Dante fuic amicus et sutius. Cecco d'Ascoli, in the third book of his encyclopedic poem La Cerba, treats of the origin of nobility, which he says he had already been treated of by the Florentine poet in his polished verse. Fu già trattato con le dolci rime, e definito il nobile valore, dal Fiorentino con l'acute lime. The reference, of course, being to the canzone Le dolci rime d'amor ch'io solia, prefixed to the fourth book of the Convivio. Cecco controverts Dante's theory, and maintains that nobility is due to the influence of one of the heavens, namely that of Mercury, upon the individual possessed of ancient blood. But hereupon he interjects, Dante wrote to me to express a doubt, saying, 2 sons are born at birth, and the elder turns out more noble than the other, or vice versa, as I have known before now. I am returning to Ravenna, and shall not depart thence again. Tell me, you of Ascoli, what have you to say to this? And I wrote back to Dante, Ma qui me scrisse dubitando Dante, son 2 figlioli nati in unu parto, e più gentil si mostra quel davante, et siu conversa, e più gentil si mostra quel davante, et ciò converso, com gia vedi, torno a Ravenna, e di lì non m'imparto. Di me Esculano, huel che tu credi. Resissi a Dante, intendi tu che leggi. And then he proceeds to develop his argument. This correspondence with Cecco d'Ascoli must have taken place during the last 3 or 4 years of Dante's life, while he was the guest of Guido Novello da Polenta at Ravenna, that is, probably, not earlier than 1317. Villani's testimony is contained in the 9th book of his Chronica, a chapter of which, under the year 1321, the year of Dante's death, is devoted to a brief biographical account of his distinguished fellow citizens. X 136. Chi fu il poeta Dante Alighieri di Firenze. In this account, in which he gives an enumeration of Dante's most important writings, after mentioning the Vita Nuova and the Canzoni, Villani says, This Dante, when he was in exile, wrote, among others, 3 noble letters, one of which he sent to the government of Florence, complaining of his undeserved exile. The second he sent to the Emperor Henry, when he was besieging Brescia, reproaching him for his delay, after the manner of the prophets of old. And the third he sent to the Italian cardinals, at the time of the vacancy of the Holy See after the death of Pope Clement, urging them to agree together in electing an Italian Pope. These letters were written in Latin, in a lofty style, fortified with admirable precepts and authorities, and were greatly commended by men of wisdom and discernment. Of the 3 letters specifically mentioned by Villani, 2 have been preserved, namely, that to the Emperor Henry, Epistola VII, and that to the Italian cardinals, Epistola VIII. The third, that to the Florentine government, which is perhaps identical with one of those mentioned by a subsequent authority, Leonardo Bruni, has not come down to us. Valuable evidence, direct and indirect, is supplied in the next generation by Boccaccio, who, in his Vita di Dante, written probably between 1357 and 1362, says that the poet wrote many prose epistles in Latin, of which a number are still in existence, and who certainly had first-hand knowledge of at least 6 of the letters now extant. These are the letters to the Emperor Henry VII, Epistola VII, and that to a friend in Florence, Epistola IX, of which use is made in chapters 5 and 12 of the Vita di Dante, the letter to Cangran, Epistola X, which is largely utilized in the 1st and 5th lesioni of the Commento sopra la Commedia, the letter to Morello Malaspina, Epistola IV, 3, portions of which are incorporated in the letter Ignoto Militi, that beginning Ma vortis mals extra nu, and the letter to the Pistoian exile, commonly identified with Cino da Pistoia, Epistola III, 4, and to the Italian cardinals, Epistola VIII, which, together with the letter to the Florentine friend already mentioned, have been preserved in a manuscript, the only known manuscript containing them, written by Boccaccio's own hand. The letter to Cangran, it may be observed, was known in one form or another to several of the 14th century commentators on the Commedia, besides Boccaccio, namely to Guido da Pisa, circa 1324, Jacopo della Lana, circa 1326, the author of the Ottimo Commento, circa 1334, Pietro di Dante, 1340-41, Francesco da Buti, 1385-95, and Filippo Villani, 1391. But of these, Filippo Villani, who in his inaugural lecture delivered in 1391, as occupant of the Dante chair at Florence, refers to the letter as Quodam introductorum, nostri poeta, sub canto primo paradisi ad dominum canem de la Scala destinatum, is the only one who mentions that it was addressed to Cangran. Of special importance is the testimony of the next witness, Leonardo Bruni of Arezzo, otherwise known as Leonardo Arentino, the author of the most valuable, from the critical point of view, of the early lives of Dante. Bruni was not only the most distinguished humanist of his day, but as secretary to several popes and chancellor of the Florentine Republic, and as historian of the Republic, he was experienced in the handling of state papers, and in the appraisement of documentary evidence, important qualifications possessed in an equal degree by no other of the early biographers of Dante. He sets out to write as a serious historian, with the express purpose of supplying the practical deficiencies of Boccaccio's biography, which he holds to be overburdened with details of love's sighs and tears, and such-like trivialities, to the neglect of the weightier matters of life, as though, he says, man were born into this world for no other purpose than to figure in a tale of the Decameron. Bruni's statement, therefore, as to matters of fact, of which he claims to have personal cognizance, are entitled to the respect due to a writer of established reputation and authority. Among such statements in his Vita di Dante, which was written in 1436, by way of diversion, after the completion of his translation of the Poetics of Aristotle, and while he was still engaged upon the last books of his History of Florence, are several of the highest interests relating to the letters of Dante. Bruni mentions that he had himself seen several letters written by Dante's own hand, and he describes the handwriting, the only description that has come down to us, as being fine and slender and very accurate. Egregiamente disegnava, fu ancora scrittore perfetto, ed era la lettera su magra, e lunga, e molto corretta, secondo io hu veduto in alcune epistole di sua propria manoscritta, a statement which recurs in another work of his, the Dialogus ad Petrum Historum, where, speaking of Dante, he says, Leginuper quastam, eius litteras quas ille videbatur, per accurate scripsisse, erant en impropera manuatque eius sigilli obsignate. Scrisse molte epistola in prosa. He says on his list of the poet's works in the Vita, and in the course of the work he specifically mentions or refers to at least half a dozen, giving in the case of one of them a long quotation in Dante's own words, and in the case of another the opening sentence. The first letter mentioned by Bruni is in connection with the battle of Campaldino, the decisive victory at the Florentine Guelphs over the Ghibellines of Arezzo on June 11th, 1289, at which Dante, he says, was present as a combatant, as he himself relates in a letter in which he gives an account of the battle, accompanied by a plan of the operations. The next has reference to Dante's election to the Priorate, from which, he states, sprang Dante's exiles from Florence and all the adverse fortunes of his life, as he himself writes in one of his letters, the words of which are as follows: "All my woes and all my misfortunes had their origins and commencement with my unlucky election to the Priorate, of which Priorate, although I was not worthy in respect of worldly wisdom, yet in respect of loyalty and of years I was not unworthy of it, inasmuch as 10 years had passed since the battle of Campaldino, where the Ghibelline party was almost entirely broken and brought to an end, on which occasion I was present, no novice in arms, and was in great fear, and afterwards greatly elated, by reason of the varying fortunes of that battle." These are his words. In another letter recorded by Bruni, Dante defends himself from a charge of favoritism during his Priorate, in recalling the exiled Bianchi from Sarzana, while the Neri remained in banishment at Castello della Pieve. To this charge, says Bruni, Dante replied that when the exiles were recalled from Sarzana, he was no longer in office, and consequently could not be held responsible, and that moreover this recall was due to the illness and death of Guido Cavalcanti, who was attacked by malaria at Sarzana, and succumbed not long after. Bruni then tells us that after his own exile, Dante, in order to obtain his recall, wrote many letters to individual members of the Florentine government, as well as to the people of Florence. Scrisse più volte non solamente a particolari cittadini del reggimento, ma ancora al popolo. Among the rest one of some length, beginning Popule me, quid feci tibi, a sentence which in a till recently unrecorded version of Bruni's Vita is amplified by the completion of the quotation from Marqu v. into Popule me, quid feci tibi, aut in quo molestatus, for molestus, fu responde mihi. When, however, continues Bruni, the Emperor Henry VII crossed the Alps, Dante changed his tone, and began to write in abusive terms to the Florentines, calling them scellerati e cattivi, and threatening them with the vengeance of the Emperor, against whose might all resistance would be vain. But when the Emperor, whose advance against Florence had been urged by Dante, an obvious allusion to Dante's letter to the Emperor, actually made his appearance under its walls, Dante in a further letter expresses his intention of patriotic grounds of not personally assisting at the siege of his native city. Finally Bruni refers to their letter, which may or may not be identical with the letter Popule me already mentioned, in which Dante gives an inventory of his personal possessions in lands and household goods. Of the letters specified or referred to by Bruni in his Vita, 2 only are now extant, namely the abusive letter to the Florentines, Epistola VI, and that to the Emperor Henry, Epistola VII. The letter Popule me may perhaps be identified with the first of those mentioned by Villani, that written by Dante to complain of his undeserved exile from Florence. For the remainder Bruni is our sole authority. Giannozzo Manetti, who wrote a life of Dante not many years after Bruno, of whose Vita he largely availed himself, has no new information to give about the letters in general. In speaking of Dante's writings he merely remarks, "In Latino sermone multas epistolas scripsit." He does specify one particular letter, however, elsewhere, and incidentally in connection with it he uses a significant phrase, which makes it appear that he must himself have been acquainted with the letter in question, namely, that written by Dante to the Florentines at the time of the advent of Henry VII into Italy, Epistola VI, Bruni, as we have seen, states that in this letter Dante wrote abusively to the Florentines, calling them knaves and scoundrels. Manetti, who when he follows Bruni usually follows him so closely as almost to echo his words, in this instance adds a detail which he could not have derived from Bruni's Vita. When the Emperor, he says, sat down before Florence to besiege it, the Florentine exiles flocked to his camp from all sides, and Dante, full of hope, and no longer able to contain himself, indited an insulting letter to the Florentines within the city, as he himself calls them. Prionde Dantes cuique se ulterius continere non puito, quinspes plenus epistolarum quandam ad Florentinos, ud ipse vocat, inter secos, contumeliam sana scriberet, in qua esot acabissime insectatur, quam ante hac die ipsis honorifictisme loqui solitus esset. This letter, as has already been mentioned, happens to be one of those which have come down to us. Manetti's reference to the title of it, which ran Dante Alighieri Florentius et exul immerentus scalatissimis Florentis intersectis, is unmistakable, and conveys the impression that he had a personal knowledge of at least this one of Dante's letters, though, unlike Bruno, he does not inform us of the fact. That this was actually the case has recently been demonstrated by Senati in his Dante e Firenze, where he shows that Manetti was at one time in possession of a manuscript which contained no less than 9 letters written by, or attributed to, Dante, this manuscript being the now famous Vatican manuscript, Cod Vat Palat Lat 1729, of which we shall have more to say later. The next piece of evidence is supplied, not by a biographer of Dante, but by a 15th century historian, namely Flavio Biondo of Forli, who in his Historiarum ab inclinato Romano impero decades, which was completed in or about the year 1440, states that he had seen at Forli letters written by Pellegrino Calvi, secretary of Scarpetta degli Odelaffi, the Ghibelline leader in Forli, which had been dictated by Dante, and which Dante's name frequently occurs. Pellegrini Calvi for Oliviensis, Scarpetta Epistolarum Magistri, extantes litterae, Crebram Dantis mentionem habentis, a qui dictabantur, and in another passage he makes special mention of a letter written by Dante in his own name and in that of the exiled Bianchi to Cangran della Scala at the time of the advent of the Emperor Henry VII into Italy, in which Dante gave an account of the insolent reply returned by the Florentines to the ambassadors of the Emperor, a letter of which, as Biondi tells us, a copy was taken by Pellegrino Calvi, Dantes Aldeghieros, forlivi tunc agens, in Epistola ad canem grandem, Scaligerium Veronensem, partis albe extorum, et su nomina data, quum Peregrinus Calvus scriptam reliquit, talia dictit de responsione a Florientis urbem tenetiblus tunc facta. Of these letters, which must be assigned to the period of Dante's presumed residence at Forli, in 1303 and 1310, no trace has been preserved. Carlo Troia, who drew attention to these statements of Flavio Biondi with regard to Dante in his Veltro Allegorico di Dante, Florence, 1826, and Veltro Allegorico de Ghibellini, Naples, 1856, records in the latter work that, as a result of exhaustive inquiries as to the fate of the documents mentioned by Biondo, he learned that the Odelaffi papers had been entrusted to the charge of a nun of the Odelaffi family for safe custody during a period of civil commotion, and that she, in an evil hour apparently through fear of being compromised if they were found in her possession, had consigned the whole to the flames. With the next biographer of Dante, Giovanni Mario Filelfo, the last of the early biographers who has any addition to make to the information supplied by his predecessors, the number of Dante's letters increases in a most remarkable manner. Filelfo, who was the son of the famous humanist Francesco Filelfo, himself a student and expounder of Dante, wrote his life of Dante, which is in Latin, in or about the year 1467. written from Verona in December of that year by Pietro Alighieri, Dante's great-grandson, to Pietro de' Medici and Tommaso Soderini in Florence, in which it is referred to as having been recently completed. Mononsculum hoc nuper mihi de vita proviavi main Dantis ab eloquentissimo oratore, et laurea insignito Mario Filelfo editum, magnificentis vestris mitere decrevi. In this work, which it may be observed in passing has a peculiar interest for students of Dante, in that here for the first time we meet with the theory that Dante's Beatrice was a mythical, not a real personage, about as real as Pandora is the author's way of putting it. Filelfo makes very free use of the Vita of Leonardo Bruni. He does not, however, confine himself to merely repeating what Bruni says, but embellishes his statements with characteristic additions of his own. Thus, in his account of Dante's letters about the battle of Campaldino, he makes Dante claim not only to have been present, but to have taken a leading part in the engagement. Hane quodam et pugnat et victoriam, recitat ipse Dantes sua quadam epistola, declarat quod se isque interfuisse ac profuisse rebus, experimenticu omnem eius proeli ordinem. Again, where Bruni simply mentions that Dante, in order to obtain his recall from exile, wrote to individual members of the government as well as to the people of Florence, Filelfo states that he wrote letters to several particular citizens, whom he believed to be more upright than the rest, and also sundry very lengthy letters to the Florentine people. Patria gratiam masidue cupiens, plurus epistolas nedum ad nonnulus misit cives, quos intelligeret virtuti dedicatorix, sed ad populum longusculas ad modum dedit litteras. Bruni's succinct description of Dante's handwriting, which has been quoted above, is amplified by Filelfo into a detailed statement as to Dante's delight in the exercise of the pen, and, so far as his ignorance of Greek would allow, the perfect accuracy of his spelling. Delectabatur Dantes scribendi forma, et vetustate litterarum, scribebatque letteras modernas, tamen politissimas, sed longories subtili rescu, ut se illa manuscriptas fastatur habuisse Leonardus Aretinus, cufui earum, diligens inquisitor, sed orthographiam tenabat, ad unguem, quantum poterat, sine litterarum Graecarum cognitone, conficere. The many letters with which Bruni credits Dante in Filelfo's account become letters innumerable, among which he proceeds to specify three in particular, now heard of for the first time, which he asserts were addressed by Dante respectively to the King of Hungary, to Pope Boniface VIII, and to his own son at Bologna, of each of which letters he professed to quote the opening sentences. And besides these, he adds, Dante wrote other letters also, too numerous to specify, which are in the hands of many persons at the present time. Editit et epistolas innumerabilis, aliam cuios es ho principium, ad invictissimum, hunorum regem, magna dete fama in omnes dissipata, rex dignissime, coegit me indignitum, exponere manum calamo, et ad tuam humanitatem accedere, aliam cuius est initium, rudsus ad bonifacium, pontificem maximum, beatitudinis tua sanctitas, nihil potest cogitare pollutum, quavicis in terris gerens Christi, tutius es misericordia sedes, verea pietatis exemplum, summa religionis apex, aliam qua filium aliquiatur, qui boninae aberat, cuius hoc est principium, scienta mi fili, coronat homines, et eos contentos reddit, quam cupiunt sapiens, negligunt insistipiens, honorant boni, vituperanti mali, edit alias quas habent multi, mihi quodam est enumerable difficile. If this very precise and circumstantial account of letters of Dante, of which no previous writer had made mention, could have been accepted as authentic, as it was by Filelfo's editor, Domenico Moreni, and by Pelli, Balbo, and others, it would have made a most interesting and valuable addition to our scanty information on the subject. Unfortunately, however, Filelfo is a writer whose unsupported assertions it is impossible to regard without grave suspicion, even when he claims, as he does with respect to his Life of Dante, that he has recorded only what he knew of his own personal knowledge, or had seen with his own eyes. Eadum taxat refero, quae certo sci, quaque ipse vidi, cetera non ausim affirmare. Apart from palpable misstatements of fact, instances of which have been pointed out by Bartoli and others, there are at least 2 demonstrable falsifications in this same work. When he comes to deal with the De Monarchia and the De Vulgari Eloquentia, in his account of Dante's writing, Filelfo, as in the case of the 3 letters above mentioned, makes a parade of quoting the beginnings of each of these treatises. Romano quidem stilo editit opus, qui monarchia dedit nomen, cuius hoc est principium. Magnitudo eius, qui sedes in throno cunctis dominatur, in caelo stans omnia videt, nusquam exclusus, nubili est inclusus, at dividit gratia munera, ut mutus aliquando faciat loqui. Editi et opus de vulgari eloquenta, hoc principio, ut Romana lingua in totum est orbem nobilitata terrarum, id nostri copiu nobilitare suam, proptaria quid difficultis est hodie recte nostram quam perite Latina quid quam dicere. A glance at the actual beginnings of the De Monarchia and De Vulgari Eloquentia will suffice to show that these alleged quotations by Filelfo do not bear the smallest resemblance to what Dante really wrote, and are in fact unblushing fabrications on Filelfo's part. Fabrications, it may be explained, in which it was comparatively safe for him to indulge, in view of the circumstance that the treatises in question existed only in manuscript at the time, and that the manuscripts were few and not easily accessible. Such being the case, we have no alternative but to conclude, as most recent critics have done, that the letters quoted as Dante's by Filelfo are equally apocryphal. It is not without significance in this connection that Filelfo's best known work, of which no less than 8 editions were printed in the 15th century, was an Epistolarium sede arte conficiendi epistolas opus, so that no doubt in his confection of these alleged letters of Dante he was but exercising himself in an art of which he was the professed exponent. With Filelfo we take leave of the early biographers of Dante. Subsequent notices, such as those of Landino and Velutello, containing nothing, so far as Dante's letters are concerned, in a more or less meagre form of what had already appeared in the lives of Boccaccio or of Bruni. It was not until the middle of the 16th century that the first actual text of a letter of Dante was given to the world. This was in 1547, in which year was published in Florence a slim quarto of 8 pages, now exceedingly rare, entitled Pros Antiche di Dante, Petrarca et Boccaccio, et di molti altri nobili et virtuosi ingegni, nuovamente raccolta, of which the editor, as well as printer, was the eccentric Anton Francesco Doni, as Epistola di Dante Alighieri posta Fiorentino al Imperator, Arrigo di Lussemburgo, and is in fact an Italian translation, in a very corrupt and mutilated text, of Dante's letter to the Emperor Henry VII, the Latin original of which, as we have seen, was known to Villani, Boccaccio, and Bruni. The last piece but one in the volume is a letter in Italian, al magnifico Messer Guido da Polenta, Signor da Ravenna, dated from Venice, March 30, 1314, and signed, L'umil servo vostro Dante Alighieri Fiorentino. No indication is given by Doni as to the source from which these 2 letters are derived. As regards the genuineness of the Italian translation of the letter to Henry VII, there can be no manner of doubt, inasmuch as numerous manuscripts of it are in existence, and it more or less closely corresponds with the Latin text as we now have it. The letter to Guido da Polenta, however, stands on a very different footing. Not only has no manuscript of this letter ever been heard of, but it bears on the face of it undoubtable proofs of his falsity. The letter, which purports to be an account of Dante's experiences as envoy of Guido da Polenta to the Venetian Republic to offer congratulations on the recent election of a new Doge, runs as follows: To the magnificent Messer Guido da Polenta, Lord of Ravenna. Anything in the world should I sooner have expected to see rather than what I have actually in person seen and experienced of the character of this exalted government. To quote the words of Virgil, Minuit praesentia famam. I had imagined to myself that I should here find those noble and magnanimous Catos, those severe censors of depraved morals, in short everything which this people, in their most pompous and pretentious fashion, would have unhappy and afflicted Italy believe that they themselves specially represent. Do they not style themselves rerum dominos gentemque togatam? O truly unhappy and misguided populace, so insolently oppressed, so vilely governed, and so cruelly maltreated by these upstarts, these destroyers of ancient law, these perpetrators of injustice and corruption! But what am I to say to you of the dense and bestial ignorance of these grave and reverend signors? On coming into the presence of so ripe and venerable a council, in order not to derogate from your dignity and my own authority, I purpose to perform my office as your ambassador in that tongue, which along with the imperial power of fair Ausonia is daily declining, and is ever destined to decline, hoping perchance to find it throned in its majesty in this distant corner, hereafter to be spread abroad with the power of this state throughout the length and breadth of Europe at the least. But alas! I could not have appeared more of a stranger and foreigner had I but just arrived from the remotest Thule in the west. Nay, I should have been more likely to find an interpreter of my unknown tongue if I had come to them from the fabled Antipodes, than to be listened to here with the eloquence of Rome upon my lips. For no sooner had I pronounced a few words of the exordium, which I had prepared in your name in felicitation of the recent election and this most serene Doge, namely, Lux orta est Iosto, et rectis corde laetetia, then it was intimated to me that I must either provide myself with an interpreter, or speak in another language. Accordingly, whether more in amazement or indignation I know not, I began to make a short speech in the tongue which has been mine from the cradle. This, however, proved to be hardly more familiar or native to them than the Latin had been. Hence it has come about that instead of being the bearer to them of joy and gladness, I have been the sower, in the most fertile field of their ignorance, of the abundant seeds of wonder and confusion. And it is no matter for wonder if the Italian tongue is unintelligible to them, seeing that they are descended from Dalmatians and Greeks, and have brought no other contribution to this noble land than the vilest and most shameless practices, together with the abomination of every sort of unbridled licentiousness. I have thought it incumbent on me, therefore, to send you this brief account of the mission which I have accomplished on your behalf, begging you at the same time, though you may always command my services, not to use me further on such like employments, from which you can look for no credit at any time, nor I for consolation. I shall remain here for a few days in order to satisfy the natural appetite of my bodily eyes for the wonders and attractions of this place, after which I shall transport myself to that most welcome haven of my rest, under the gracious protection of your royal courtesy. From Venice, this 30th day of March, 1314, your humble servant, Dante Alighieri of Florence. Apart from the manifest absurdity of the charge against the Venetians that they could understand neither Latin, which was in fact at the time in Venice as elsewhere in Italy the official language of the state, nor Italian, the following blunders chronological and otherwise have been pointed out amongst others as fatal to the pretension of this letter to be considered authentic. To begin with, all the available evidence goes to prove that Dante did not take refuge with Guido da Polenta at Ravenna till 1317 or 1318, that is to say, not till 3 or 4 years after the alleged date, 1314, of this embassy to Venice. Secondly, in the year 1314 Guido da Polenta was not Lord of Ravenna, as he is styled in the letter, but Podesta of Cesena. Thirdly, the so-called recent election of the Doge Dianzoranzo had taken place more than a year and a half before, namely in July 13, 1312. Finally, we have the damning fact that Dante, who claims in the Commedia that he knew the Aeneid tutta quanta, is made to attribute to Virgil a quotation from Claudian, an author with whom there is no evidence that he had any acquaintance. To all of which may be added the further objections that the letter is written in Italian, instead of Latin as we should naturally expect, and that it has a most decided cinquentoring about it, being as unlike Dante's known epistolary style as it could well be. Doni included Dante's letter to the Emperor Henry, with other pieces from the Prose Antiquae, in a subsequent work, his Succa, which he published at Venice in 1552, but he did not reprint the letter to Guido, of which it has not unnaturally been assumed that he himself was the fabricator. This letter, nevertheless, was accepted as genuine by Biscioni, who reproduced it, together with that to the Emperor, in his Prose di Dante Alighieri e di Messer Giovanni Boccaccio, published at Florence in 1723, and it has also found supporters in Tasso, in his Dialogo del Forno, published in 1581, and Fontanini, as well as in Torri Fratichelli and Schäfer-Biokorst, among others of more recent date. A few years after the publication of Doni's prose, we hear from several quarters of the letter to Cangran, Epistola X, which, as has already been mentioned, was utilized by several of the early commentators on the Commedia, though, with the exception of Filippo Villani, they make no reference to it by name. Giovan Battista Gelli, best known as the author of I Capricci del Bottaio, English not long after his death, as the fearful fancies of the Florentine Cooper, who delivered a series of public lectures on Dante before the Florentine Academy at various times between 1541 and 1563, in a discussion in his 8th course, in 1562, as to the title Commedia bestowed by Dante on his poem, recapitulates what he had said on the subject in a previous lecture, and then proceeds as follows. All that I told you on the former occasion as the expression of my own personal opinion, I today repeat to you as a matter of my own knowledge. For a year or two ago there came into my hands, through the good offices of the deceased Tommaso Santini, a fellow citizen of ours, a letter in Latin, which our poet sent to the Lord Cangrande della Scala, Vicar General of the Principality of Verona and of Vicenza, together with a presentation copy of the 3rd cantica of his poem, namely the Paradiso, in which letter he treats of certain matters, with a view to the better understanding of his purpose in the poem, and among others of the reason why he gave to it this title of Commedia. He points out that comedy differs from tragedy in its subject matter, inasmuch as tragedy in its beginning is admirable and quiet, but in its ending foul and horrible, these being our author's own expressions, whereas comedy begins with an element of adversity, but in the end turns out happily, a circumstance, he adds, which has given rise to the employment by some letter-writers of the salutation tragicum principium et comicum finem, as a substitute for the conventional greeting. Again, he shows that comedy differs from tragedy in the style of its diction, the language of tragedy being lofty and inflated, while that of comedy is unstudied and homely. Whence he concludes, and Gelli here quotes the original text of Dante's letters, Et per hoc patet quod commedia dictitur praesens opus, nam si ad materiam afficiamus a principu horribilis, et foetida est, quia infenus, in fine prospera, desiderabilis et grata, quia paradisus. Ad modum loquendi, remissus est modus et humilis, quia locutio vulgaris, in qua et mulier culae communicant, et sic patet, qua commedia dicitur. Gelli quotes the letter a second time in another lecture, of which only a fragment has been preserved, in connection with Dante's sketching apostrophe to Florence at the beginning of the 26th canto of the Inferno. Not only, he says, did Dante rebuke Florence in this place, and in numerous other passages in his works, but he twice in the letter he sent to Cangrande, Lord of Verona, with a copy of his poem, describes himself in these terms: Dantes Alighierus, Florentinus Patria, sed non moribus. The Cangran letter was known also to sundry other writers on Dante in the 16th century, contemporaries of Gelli (1498 to 1563), among others to Lodovico Castelvetro (1505 to 71) of Modena, Vincenzo Borghini (1515 to 80) of Florence, and Jacopo Massoni (1548 to 98) of Cesena. Castelvetro in his Sposizioni di Canti 29 del Inferno di Dante, first published in 1886, identifies the Veltro in Inferno I, 101, with Can Grande, to whom, he says, according to Boccaccio in his Life of Dante, the poet dedicated the Commedia. But, he continues, I have in my possession a manuscript of a letter of Dante's written in Latin, which begins Dante Alighierus nationone Florentinus, non moribus magno cani, etc., from which letter it clearly appears that Dante dedicated to Can Grande not the whole poem, but the Paradiso only. It should be noted that Castelvetro here misrepresents Boccaccio, who does not assert positively that Dante dedicated the Commedia as a whole to Can Grande, but states that opinions differ as to the dedication, inasmuch as, according to some, Dante dedicated the Inferno to Uguccione della Fagiuola, the Purgatorio to Morella Malaspina, and the Paradiso to Frederick III of Sicily, while, according to others, he dedicated the whole poem to Can Grande. Castelvetro quotes the title of the letter again, in his comment on Inferno 1569, as a proof that Dante obeyed Brunetto Latini's injunction to dissociate himself from the evil ways of the Florentines. Da lor costumi facet tutti forbi. Borghini makes use of the letter in his Introduzione al poema di Dante per l'Allegoria, first printed in 1855, in which he quotes long extracts from the letter in the original Latin, namely No. 7 and 8, and parts of No. 15 and 16, to show with what object Dante wrote the Commedia, and the various senses in which he meant it to be interpreted, and part of No. 32 for Dante's explanation why he did not continue his exposition of the poem, his reason being the Rai familiaris angustia. Borghini says that the text of the letters as seen by him, which he evidently amended in the passages he has quoted, was so corrupt as to be hardly intelligible, and after stating that it was at the time known to many persons, in mano di molti, he observes that by some of the old commentators on the Commedia the letter was prefixed to the commentary as the author's own preface to his poem, an interesting observation, which, however, is not confirmed by our present knowledge of the early commentaries. Massoni's mention of the letter occurs in the Introduzione e Sommario of the first volume of his celebrated Difesa di Dante, which was published in Cesena in 1587. In his summary of the contents of the last chapter of the first book, he says, "It is shown in this chapter that Dante's poem was composed by him in the form of a vision, as he himself has openly declared in his Vita Nuova, as well as in a Latin letter, which he sent to Cane della Scala, explaining the purpose of the third cantica of his poem, which letter was sent to me from Florence a few days ago by Signor Domencio Mellini, a most worthy gentleman and lover of letters." He then proceeds to excuse himself from discussing the letter at that point, on the ground that it was his intention to speak of it at length in his second volume. This second volume, however, which was not published till 1688, 90 years after Massoni's death, unfortunately contains no reference to the letter, whence it has been concluded either that his projected disquisition on the subject was never written, or that it was suppressed by his editor. In the 7th century we find notice for the first time of the existence of the Latin text of the letter to the Emperor Henry VII. This occurs in the notes, first printed in 1636, on the De Rebus Gestis Henrici VII. Of Albertino Messato by Lorenzo Pignoria of Padua, 1571 to 1631, who states that he had in his own possession a manuscript of this text. He identifies the letter with that mentioned by Villani, and with that printed in Italian by Doni, and promises to publish it, a promise which remained unfulfilled. Dantes vatum clarissimus, he writes, Hiscidiebus epistolam scripsit Henrico, quam nacti in parvetusto codice, nostro manuscripto public iurus facere decrevimus, et scribi curavimos, spicellegi nostri, cum aliis nunnules, eiusdem aeri monumentis, et eiusdem epistola memenit, Johannes Villanus, lib 9, cap 35, quam etiam alitisa reditam vidimus, et editam Florentiae, anno 1547. In the last year of this century, 1700, the complete text of the letter to Cangran was published at Venice in a literary period called La Galleria di Minerva, to which it had been communicated 2 years before by Girolamo Barufaldi, sub-librarian at the public library at Ferrara, this being the first letter of Dante to be given to the world in the original Latin. In his dedicatory note to Guilo Cesare Grassini, secretary of the Academy of the Intrepidi of Ferrara, Barufaldi states that the letter, which he describes as una antica e non pubblicata pistola del divino Dante Alighieri, had been discovered a short time previously in a manuscript in the collection of the well-known scholar and physician of Ferrara, Giuseppe Lanzoni, 1663–1730, who had obligingly placed it at his disposal. Barufaldi printed at the head of the letter Prefatii inserti Acturis, which runs as follows: It was customary in former times for writers to prefix to their works a few introductory remarks, which the briefer they were, the more quickly they led up to the subject of the work in question, especially in the case of authors who were not gifted with the elegant and correct style of diction proper to professed teachers of rhetoric. I will hasten, therefore, to acquit myself of my task, lest, while studying to avoid prolixity, I should fall into that very fault. Suffice it then that in lieu of a preface I present the reader with what the poet wrote to Messer Cane, to whom he dedicated this third cantica, whereby the intention in the poem may the more easily be comprehended from the observations to which he himself gave expression in the following form. This preface, which occurs in 4 of the 6 known manuscripts, was reprinted by the 18th century editors, but it has been discarded by the more recent editors of the Letters of Dante. The text of the letter as printed in the Galleria di Minerva was full of blunders, due either to the original scribe or to the copyist of the Lanzoni manuscript, and in this corrupt form it continued to be reproduced for more than 100 years. It may be mentioned that a collation with this text of the passages recorded above, as having been quoted by Gelli and Borghini, shows that the latter were not derived from the same manuscript as the Barufaldi text. Later in this century we get the first accession to the list of letters hitherto recorded. This consists of the letter to the princes and people of Italy, Epistola V, in an Italian version, which was printed in a collection of letters of the 11th, 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, published at Rome in 1754 by Pietro Lazzari, from manuscripts in the library of the Jesuits' College at Rome. Lazzari states that the manuscript in which the letter occurs contained also the Italian version of Dante's letter to the Emperor, as well as Marsilio Ficoni's translation of the De Monarchia, extracts from the Vita Nuova, and Bruni's Lives of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. He remarks that the text of the letter to the Emperor differs to some extent from that printed by Bisconi, from which he concludes, rightly as we now know, that both that letter and the one he now prints for the first time were originally written in Latin. In 1788, Giovan Jacopo Dionisi of Verona printed in the 4th volume of his series of Aneddoti sundry variants from a manuscript, at that time in the Cocci collection, now in the chapter library at Verona, of the letter to Cangran, and 2 years later, 1790, he printed for the first time, in the 5th volume of the same series, the Latin text of yet another letter of Dante, namely, the letter to a Florentine friend. This letter was discovered at Florence in the now famous Laurentian manuscript, usually known as the Sibaldone Boccacesco. The contents of this manuscript had been described by Bandini in the volume of his catalogue of the manuscript in the Laurentian library published in 1775, but he does not appear to have had any inkling as to the authorship of the letter, which, together with 2 others in the same manuscript, he registered as anonymous. The Abate Mehus, however, who a few years before, in 1759, had printed in his Vita Ambrosi Camaldulensis the much discussed letter of Frate Ilario from the same manuscript, recognized Dante as the author of the letter to a Florentine friend, and communicated the fact to Dionisi, who printed it accordingly. His original text in the Anadotti having been very imperfect, Dionisi subsequently issues an amended text in his Preparazione storica e critica alla nuova edizione di Dante Alighieri, which was published at Verona in 1806. 20 years later, in 1826, Carlo Troia made a fresh examination of the letters in the Laurentian manuscript, and satisfied himself that not only the letter to a Florentine friend, but also the other two letters, which immediately preceded in the manuscript, and which Bandini had catalogued as anonymous, were written by Dante. In the former of these two letters, which is headed Cardinalibus Italis Dedi Florentina, he recognized the letter mentioned by Villani as having been written by Dante to the Italian cardinals after the death of Clement V. The second letter is headed Exulanti Pistoriensi Florentinus exul immerentus, the addressee of which Troia identified with Dante's friend, Cino da Pistoia, an identification which has been generally accepted, as has that of the Florentine exul immerentus, with Dante himself. Troia's famous Veltro Allegriocchi di Dante being at that time on the eve of publication, he was unable to include these two new letters in that work, but he announced his discovery in the book, and by way of specimen printed the first few paragraphs of the letter to the cardinals in an appendix. Besides the letters of Dante and of Frate Ilario, this Laurentian manuscript contains the poetical correspondence of Dante and Giovanni del Virgilio. It has recently been established by Henry Hovet that these portions of the manuscript are in the handwriting of Boccaccio, who, as we have already stated, made use in his Vita di Dante of the letter to a Florentine friend, and also, it may here be added, of the letter of Frate Ilario in the same work. In 1827, the year following Troia's announcement of his discovery in the Laurentian manuscript, appeared the first attempt at a collected edition of the letters of Dante. This was Carl Witte's Dante's Alighieri Epistolae quac extant, which was printed privately in 60 copies only, at Padua in that year. The contents of this volume, the idea of which seemed to have been suggested to Witte by the desire for such an edition expressed nearly 100 years before by Fontanini in his Eloquenza Italiana, were as follows, there being 7 letters in all. 1. The Latin text of the letter to Cina da Pistoia, Epistola III, 4, now printed for the first time from a copy supplied by Sebastiano Ciampi from the Laurentian manuscript. 2. The Italian translation of the letter to the princes and peoples of Italy, Epistola V, first printed by Lasari at Rome in 1754. 3. The Latin text of the letter to the Emperor Henry VII, Epistola VII, now printed for the first time from a manuscript in the Biblioteca Marquiana at Venice. Witte's attention having been drawn to the fact that extracts from this letter in Latin were printed in the catalogue of the Biblioteca Muranese, search was made at his instance, through the good offices of the Marquis Gian Giacomo Trivulzio, with the result that a manuscript containing the letter was discovered by the Abate Giovanni Antonio Moschini, the Prefetto of the Biblioteca Marquiana, whither the spoils of the Murano library had been transferred. Besides the Latin text, Witte included an amended text of the Italian translation of the same letter, which had been first printed by Doni in 1547. 4. The Latin text of the letter to the Italian cardinals, Epistola VIII, now first printed in full, from the Laurentian manuscript. The first few paragraphs of this letter were, as we have seen, printed by Troia in his Veltro Allegorico, in 1826. The remainder was copied and printed by Witte himself in the same year in the Antologia of Florence, and he now printed a revised and amended text of the whole letter. 5. The Latin text, revised, of the letter to a Florentine friend, Epistola IX, first printed by Dionisi at Verona in 1790. 6. The Latin text, with numerous emendations, of the letter to Cangran, Epistola X, first printed in full by Barofaldi at Venice in 1700. 7. The apocryphal letter, as Witte does not hesitate to pronounce it, to Guido da Polenta, first printed by Doni in 1547. In 1837, 10 years after the appearance of Witte's volume, occurred what is undoubtedly the most important event yet recorded in the history of the Letters of Dante, namely, the discovery in the Vatican Library, by a German student named Theodor Heyse, while collating manuscripts of the Divina Commedia on behalf of Witte, of a 14th century manuscript, containing no less than 9 letters directly or indirectly attributed to Dante. The history of this manuscript, which, besides the Letters of Dante, contains Petrarch's 12 Eclogues and Dante's De Monarchia, so far as it has been possible to trace it, is briefly as follows. It was executed in the 14th century, apparently for Francesco da Montepulciani, of the family of the Piendibeni of that place, a Tuscan notary of some distinction, the friend and correspondent of Coluccio Salitati, the Florentine chancellor, and successor of Filippo Villani in the chancellorship of Perugia, who at the very end of the Eclogues has written his name and the date, Perugia, 20th July, 1394. Francesco da Montepulciano left his books to the capitular library of the Cathedral of Montepulciano, the greater part of which was destroyed by fire in 1539, but this manuscript, by some chance, before that date, had come into the possession of the Florentine scholar and biographer of Dante, Gianosso Manetti, 1396 to 1459, whence it eventually passed into the collection of the celebrated bibliophile, Ulrich Fugger, 1526 to 84, son of Raymond Fugger, one of the famous merchant princes of Augsburg. Ulrich Fugger, whose extravagance in the matter of books was such that at one time his family obtained a decree to restrict his expenditure, as is well known, became a Protestant, and to escape persecution took refuge in the Rhenish Palatinate and settled at Heidelberg, where he died in 1584, leaving his extensive collection of manuscripts to the library of that city. After the capture of Heidelberg by Tilly in 1622, the most valuable portion of the library, consisting of nearly 200 cases of manuscripts, was presented by Maximilian I of Bavaria in return for the papal support, to Pope Gregory XV, and was transferred to Rome and was incorporated in the Vatican Library under the superintendence of Leone Alacacci. Among the manuscripts thus removed to the Vatican were many which had formed part of the Fugger collection, one of them being this manuscript, containing the 9 letters attributed to Dante, discovered by Heyse. Witte, having received copies of the letters from Heyse, wrote an account of them, with copious (translated) extracts, in the article entitled Nur aufgefundene Briefe des Dante Alighieri, which appeared in Blatter für literarische Unterhaltung in May 1838, and prepared to edit and publish them. But while he was engaged upon the work, his portfolio containing the transcripts of the letters was stolen from him, and it was more than 2 years before he could succeed in getting fresh copies made. In the meantime, attention having been directed to the manuscript by the publication of Witte's article, one of the employees at the Vatican Library, Massi by name, took copies of the letters on his own account, with the intention of forestalling Witte's projected edition. Massi, however, was unable to obtain the necessary imprimatur, and he then, in the autumn of 1841, offered his copies to Alessandro Torri of Pisa, who had been for some time engaged upon an edition of the minor works of Dante. Torri availed himself of the offer, and forthwith proceeded to Rome for the purpose of collating the copies with the original manuscript in the Vatican. Having satisfied himself as to their accuracy, he included the 9 letters in his volume Epistola di Dante Alighieri, edite e indite, which was published at Leghorn at the end of the following year, 1842. It should be mentioned that before the publication of Torri's volume, Witte had printed the text of one of the letters in the Vatican manuscripts in an appendix to the 2nd volume of Dante Alighieri's Lyrische Gedichte, published by Karl Ludwig Kannegeiser and himself at Leipzig earlier in the same year. Of the letters contained in the Vatican manuscript, all except one, namely that to the Emperor Henry VII, were now made known for the first time, or for the first time in the original Latin text. The letters, in the order of their occurrence in the manuscript, are as follows: 1. To the Emperor Henry VII, Epistola VII, the Latin text of which had been printed by Witte in his collected edition in 1827 from the Marqian manuscript. 2. To the Florentines, Epistola VI, Scelitissimis Florentinis intersecis, the title and contents of which prove it to be the abusive letter mentioned by Bruni and Manetti as having been written by Dante to the Florentines after the coming of Henry VII into Italy. 3, 4, 5. 3 short letters written in the name of a Countess of Battifol to Margaret of Brabanti, wife of the Emperor Henry, Epistola VII. 6. To the Counts Oberto and Guido da Romena, Epistola II. 7. To the Marquis Morello Malaspina, Epistola IV. 3. This being the letter mentioned above as having been printed by Witte in Dante's Lyrische Gedichte. 8. To the Cardinal Niccolo da Prato, Epistola I. 9. To the princes and peoples of Italy, Epistola V, which had been printed in an Italian version by Lazari in 1754. Of these 9 letters, 5 are definitely ascribed to Dante by name in the manuscript, while it is evident, from the places assigned to them in the midst of the others, that the remaining 4, namely the 3 to the Empress and that to the Cardinal Niccolo, were regarded by the compiler of the collection as having been written by Dante. With Torri's edition of the letters, finality was reached, so far as numbers are concerned. This totally consisted of 14 letters, which was made up of the 3 from the Laurentian manuscript, the 9 from the Vatican manuscript, the letter to Cangran, and the letter to Guido da Polenta. That is to say, his edition included the 10 letters now usually accepted as Dante's, Epistles 1 to 10 in the Oxford Dante, together with the 3 Battifolle letters, as to which doubts still exist, and the Polenta letter, now almost universally recognized as a falsification. In 1857, Fratichelli published at Florence a revised edition of the letters, in which were embodied sundry emendations, the results of a fresh collation of the manuscripts by Witte, which, however, were by no means almost improvements, for textual criticism, in spite of Witte's reputation as critic and editor, was not altogether his strongest point. In 1882 Giuliani published, also at Florence, an edition of all the letters, with characteristic emendations of his own, while from time to time, in the course of the last 60 years or so, critical or diplomatic texts of individual letters have been printed by various editors, for example, by Torricelli, Epistola V, Musi, Epistola III, IV, VIII, IX, Senati, Epistola I, IV, III, Torraca, Epistola IV, III, Della Torre, Epistola IX, Boffito, Epistola X, Novati, Epistola IV, III, Rostagno, Epistola VIII, and Parodi, Epistola III, IV. In 1895, Barbi drew attention to the Bollettino della Società Dantesca Italiana to yet another manuscript, the 4th, containing letters of Dante. This was the 14th century San Pantaleo manuscript in the Biblioteca Vittorio Emanuele at Rome, which had been registered by Colomb de Batines in his Bibliographia Dantesca 50 years before, but had strangely been overlooked by all the editors of the letters. During the last few years diplomatic text of the 2 letters contained in this San Pantaleo manuscript, of the 1 in the Venetian manuscript, of the 9 in the Vatican manuscript, and of the 3 in the Laurentian manuscript, together with the amended text of 10 of the letters, viz. Epistola III, IV, V, VI, VII, VIII, IX, X, and the 3 Battifolle letters, have been printed in the Modern Language Review by the present writer, with a view to the improvement of the text in the Oxford Dante, as a preparation for the present edition. The critical edition of the letters, undertaken by the Italian Dante Society, which was entrusted originally to Noati, and, since his death, to Pistoi, who recently printed trial texts of Epistola VII and IX, is still awaited, and now, owing to the war, is not likely to see the light for some time after the latest term originally fixed by the Society, namely, the 6th century of the death of Dante in September 1921. End of Introduction.
Chapter 1 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. Epistola I, to the Cardinal Niccolò da Prato, 1304. To the most reverend Father in Christ, their most beloved Lord, the Lord Nicholas, by divine grace Bishop of Ostia and Velletri, Legate of the Apostolic See, and by Holy Church ordained pacificator in Tuscany, Romagna, the March of Treviso, and the regions circumadjacent, his most devoted sons, Alexander the Captain, the Council, and the whole body of the White Party of Florence, commend themselves in all devotion and zeal. In submission to salutary admonishment, and in response to the apostolic holiness, after precious consultation, we make reply to the tenor of the sacred utterance which you have addressed to us. And should we be held guilty of negligence or of slothfulness by occasion of any prejudice due to our tardiness, may your holy discretion lean to the hither side of condemnation, regard being had to the number and nature of the consultations and communications necessary for the proper conduct of the affairs of our brotherhood, and for the observance of good faith with the League. But if, after consideration of the facts here submitted to you, we perchance be blamed as having been wanting in due diligence, we pray that the superabundant bounty of your benignity may incline you to indulgence. As not ungrateful sons, therefore, we examine the letter of your gracious paternity, which, in that it gives expression to the prelude of the whole matter of our desires, forthwith filled our minds with joy so exceeding great that by none could it be measured either in word or in thought. For the healing of our country, for which we have yearned, longing for it as it were even in our dreams, in the course of your letter, under the guise of fatherly admonition, is more than once promised us. And for what else did we plunge into civil war? What else did our white standard seek? And for what else were our swords and our spears dyed with crimson? Save that they, who at their own mad will and pleasure have maimed the body of civil right, should submit their necks to the yoke of beneficent law, and should be brought by force to the observance of their country's peace. In sooth, the lawful shaft of our purpose, leaping from the bowstring we held stretched, sought solely the peace and liberty of the people of Florence, sought and ever will seek. But if your vigilance is intent on a consummation so dear to us, and you are resolved, as the end of your holy endeavors, that our foes shall return to the furrows of good citizenship, who shall attempt to render adequate thanks to you? Not in our power is it, O Father, nor in that of any of the Florentine race throughout the world. But if there exists any goodness in heaven which looks upon such deeds as worthy of recompense, may it grant meet reward to you, who have clothed yourself with compassion for so great a city, and are hastening to compose the unholy strife of her citizens. Whereas, then, by Brother L., a man of holy religion, and an advocate of good citizenship and of peace, we are urgently on your behalf admonished and required, which was likewise the import of your letter, to cease from all assault and act of war, and to commit ourselves wholly to your fatherly hands, we, as sons most devoted to yourself, and as lovers of peace and justice, putting off our swords, of our own free will and without reservation, submit ourselves to your judgment, as by the report of your messenger, the aforesaid Brother L., shall be made known to you, and by public instruments in due form shall be declared abroad. With filial voice, therefore, we most affectionately implore that your most merciful holiness may bedew with the calm of tranquillity and peace this Florence so long tempest-tossed, and that as a loving father you may keep under your protection ourselves, who have ever been the defenders of her people, and all who are under our authority. For as we have never been remiss in our love for our country, so we look never to stray.
Chapter 2 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. Section 2. This letter was written by Dante Alighieri to the Counts Oberto and Guido da Romena after the death of their uncle, Count Alessandro da Romena, to condole with them on his decease. Your uncle, the illustrious Count Alessandro, who in these last days returned after the Spirit to the heavenly fatherland whence he came, was my lord, and his memory will have dominion over me so long as my life shall last in this world. For his nobility of soul, which now is richly recompensed with meet rewards beyond the stars, for long years past, as he willed, made me his servant. And verily, this quality, accompanied as it was in him by all the other virtues, caused his name to stand out, as it were in bronze, above the fame of other Italians. And what else did his heroic escutcheon proclaim, but that we display the scourge that drives away vice? For as his outward blazon he bore silver scourges on a purple field, and inwardly a mind repellent of vice in its love of virtue. Lament, therefore, lament, thou noblest of the houses of Tuscany, that shone with the light of so great a man. Lament, all ye his friends and servants, whose hope death hath so cruelly stricken. And among the last, woe is me! Must I too lament, who, driven from my country in undeserved exile, was wont, as I brooded over my unhappy fate with unceasing anxiety, to console myself with the hope which I rested in him. But, although the bitterness of grief weigh upon us for the loss of corporeal things, yet, when we consider the intellectual things which remain, surely before the eyes of the mind must arise the light of sweet consolation. For he, by whom virtue was honored on earth, is now held in honor of the virtues in heaven. And he who was a palatine of the court of Rome in Tuscany, now glories as a chosen courtier with the princes of the blessed in the everlasting palace of the Jerusalem which is above. Wherefore, my beloved lords, with humble exhortation I beseech you to grieve not over much, and to put behind you bodily concerns, save in so far as they may serve you for examples. And as he himself, a most just man, appointed you to be the heirs of his possessions, so do you, as those nearest to him, clothe yourselves with his most excellent qualities. But I must add a word on my own behalf, in appeal to your judgment, to excuse myself as your servant for my absence from the mournful ceremony. For it was neither neglect nor ingratitude which kept me away, but the unlooked-for poverty brought about by exile. Poverty, like a vindictive fury, has thrust me, deprived of horses and arms, into her prison den, where she has set herself relentlessly to keep me in durance. And though I Chapter 3 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. To the exile from Pistoia a Florentine, undeservedly in exile, wishes health through long years and the continuance of fervent love. The warmth of your affection has addressed to me an expression of signal confidence, wherein, my dearest friend, you put the question whether the soul can pass from passion to passion. That is to say, from one passion to another. The nature of the passion remaining the same, but the objects being different, not in kind, but in identity. Although the answer would more properly have come from your own lips, you have nevertheless chosen to make me the arbiter, to the end that by the solution of this much debated question you might enhance the renown of my name. How welcome, how grateful this was to me when I heard of it! Words could not convey without falling lamentably short of the truth. Wherefore you, being acquainted with the cause of my reticence, must yourself take the measure of what I have left unexpressed. Behold, there is given below a discourse in the diction of Calliope, wherein the Muse declares in set phrase, though, as poets use, the meaning is conveyed under a figure, that love for one object may languish and finally die away, and that, inasmuch as the corruption of one thing is the begetting of another, love for a second may take shape in the soul. And the truth of this, although it is proved by experience, may be confirmed by reason and authority. For every faculty which is not destroyed after the consummation of one act is naturally reserved for another. Consequently, the faculties of sense, if the organ survives, are not destroyed by the consummation of one act, but are naturally reserved for another. Since, then, the appetitive faculty, which is the seat of love, is a faculty of sense, it is manifest that after the exhaustion of the passion by which it was brought into operation, it is reserved for another. The major and minor propositions of the syllogism, the entrance to which lies open without difficulty, may be left to your diligence for proof. It remains to consider the authority of Ovid in the 4th book of the Metamorphoses, which bears directly and literally upon our proposition, namely the passage wherein the author says, in the story of the 3 sisters who were contemptuous of the son of Semele, addressing the son, who, after he had deserted and neglected other nymphs of whom he had previously been enamored, was newly in love with Leucothoe. What now, son of Hyperion? And what follows? In conclusion, dearest brother, I exhort you, so far as in you lies, to arm yourself with patience against the darts of Nemesis. Read, I beg you, the remedies against fortune, which are offered to us, as it were by a father to his sons, by that most famous philosopher Seneca. And especially let that saying not pass from your memory. If ye were of the world would love his own. A sonnet. I have passed my days in fellowship with love, ere since the circling sun my 9th year closed. I know how he can ply or curb or spur, and how folk laugh or groan who are his thralls. Reason or virtue who 'gainst him puts forth is like to one should pipe amid the storm, and think thereby to quell the thunder's rage, and calm the warring elements on high. Wherefore within the compass of his darts, free will forever in his danger lies. 'Gainst him in vain will counsel's shaft be sped, for with new spur his victim's flank he'll ply, and be
Chapter 4 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary J. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri, translated by Paget Toynbee. Epistola IV, to the Marquis Moroello Malaspina, circa 1309. Lest the Lord should be ignorant of the bonds of his servant, and of the spontaneity of the affection by which he is governed, and lest reports spread abroad at variance with the facts, which too often are wont to prove seed-beds of false opinion, should proclaim to be guilty of negligence him who is a captive, it has seemed good to me to address to the eyes of your magnificence this present epistle. It befell then that after my departure from the threshold of that court, which I since have so yearned for, wherein, as you often remarked with amaze, I was privileged to be enrolled in the service of liberty, no sooner had I set foot by the streams of the Arno, in all security and heedlessness, than suddenly, woe is me, like a flash of lightning from on high, a woman appeared, I know not how, in all respects answering to my inclinations, both in character and appearance. Oh, how was I dumbfounded at the sight of her! But my stupefaction gave place before the terror of the thunder that followed. For just as in our everyday experience the thunderclap instantaneously follows the flash, so at the sight of the blaze of this beauty, love, terrible and imperious, straightway laid hold on me. And he, raging like a despot expelled from his fatherland, who returns to his native soil after long exile, slew or expelled or fettered whatsoever within me was opposed to him. He slew, then, that praiseworthy resolve which held me aloof from women and from songs about women, and he pitilessly banished as suspect those unceasing meditations wherein I used to ponder the things of heaven and of earth. And finally, that my soul might never again rebel against him, he fettered my free will, so that it behoves me to turn not whither I will, but whither he wills. Love, therefore, reigns within me, with no restraining influence, and in what manner he rules me, you must inquire from what follows below, outside the limits of this present writing. Canzone. Footnote. Plumpter's translation. End footnote. Loves, since 'tis meet that I should tell my woe, that men may list to me, and show myself with all my manhood gone, grant that I may content and weeping know, so that my grief set free my words may utter, with my sense at one. Thou willst my death, and I consent thereon. But who will pardon if I lack the art to tell my pain of heart? Who will believe what now doth me constrain? But if from thee fit words for grief are won, grant, O Lord, that, ere my life depart, that cruel fair one may not hear my pain. For of my inward grief were she made ware, sorrow would make her beauteous face less fair. I cannot scape from her, but she will come within my fantasy, more than I can the thought that brings her there, the frenzied soul that brings its own ill home, painting her faithfully, lovely and stern, its own doom doth prepare. Then looks on her, and when it filled doth fare with the great longing springing from mine eyes, wroth with itself doth rise, that lit the fire where it, poor soul, doth burn. What plea of reason calms the stormy air, when such a tempest whirls o'er inward skies? The grief it cannot hold breaks forth in sighs from out my lips that others too may learn, and gives mine eyes the tears they truly earn. The image of my fair foe, which doth stay victorious and proud, and lords it o'er my faculty of will, desirous of itself, doth make me stray there where its truth is showed, as like to like, its course directing still, like snow that seeks the sun, so fare I ill. But I am powerless, and I am as they who thither take their way, as others bid, where they must fall as dead. When I draw near, a voice mine ears doth fill, which saith, Away, seekest thou his death to see? Then I look out, and search to whom to flee for succour. To this pass I now am led by those bright eyes that baleful lustres shed. What I become when smitten thus, O love, thou canst relate, not I. For thou dost stay to look while I lie dead, and if my soul back to my heart should move, blind loss of memory hath been with her while she from earth hath fled. When I rise up and see the wound that bled, and cast me down sore smitten by the blow, no comfort can I know to keep me from the shuddering thrill of fear. And then my looks, with pallor o'er them spread, show what that lightning was that laid me low. For, grant it came with sweet smile all aglow, long time all clouded doth my face appear, because my spirit gains no safety clear. Thus thou hast brought me, love, to Alpine vale, where flows the river bright, along whose banks thou still o'er me dost reign. Alive or dead thou dost at will assail, thanks to the fierce keen light, which flashing opes the way for death's campaign. Alas! for ladies fair I look in vain, or kindly men to pity my deep woe. If she unheeding go, I have no hope that others help will send. And she, no longer bound to thy domain, cares not, O sire, for dart that thou dost throw. Such shield of pride around her breast doth grow, that every dart thereon its course doth end, and thus her heart against them doth defend. Dear mountain song of mine, thou goest thy way, perchance thou'lt Florence see, mine own dear land, that drives me doomed and banned, showing no pity and devoid of love. If thou dost enter there, pass on and say, my lord no more against you can wage war. There, whence I come, his chains so heavy are that, though thy
Chapter 5 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante by Dante Alighieri, translated by Paget Toynbee. To all and singular the princes of Italy, and the senators of the sacred city, as also the dukes, marquises, counts, and peoples. A humble Italian, Dante Alighieri, a Florentine undeservedly in exile, prayeth peace. Behold, now is the accepted time, wherein arise the signs of consolation and peace. For a new day is beginning to break, revealing the dawn in the east, which even now is dispersing the darkness of our long tribulation. Already the orient breeze is freshening, the face of the heavens grows rosy, and confirms the hopes of the peoples with an auspicious calm. And we, too, who have kept vigil through the long night in the wilderness, shall behold the long-awaited joy. For the Son of Peace shall appear on high, and justice, which, like the heliotrope, deprived of his light, had grown faint, so soon as he shall dart forth his rays, once more shall revive. All they that hunger and thirst shall be satisfied in the light of his radiance, and they that delight in iniquity shall be put to confusion before the face of his splendor. For the strong lion of the tribe of Judah hath lifted up his ears in compassion, and moved by the lamentations of the multitudes in captivity, hath raised up another Moses, who shall deliver his people from the oppression of the Egyptians, and shall lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey. Rejoice, therefore, O Italy, thou that art now an object of pity even to the Saracens, for soon shalt thou be the envy of the whole world, seeing that thy bridegroom, the comfort of the nations, and the glory of thy people, even the most clement Henry, elect of God, and Augustus and Caesar, is hastening to the wedding. Dry thy tears, and wipe away the stains of thy weeping, most beauteous one. For he is at hand who shall bring thee forth from the prison of the ungodly, and shall smite the workers of iniquity with the edge of the sword, and shall destroy them. And his vineyard shall he let out to other husbandmen, who shall render the fruit of justice in the time of harvest. But will he then have mercy on none? Nay, for he will pardon all those who implore his mercy, since he is Caesar, and his sovereignty derives from the fountain of pity. His judgments abhor all severity, for he punishes ever on this side the mean, while in rewarding he aims ever beyond the mean. Will he then countenance the daring of the evildoers, and drink success to the undertakings of the presumptuous? Far be it, for he is Augustus. And being Augustus, shall he not take vengeance for the evil deeds of the backsliders, and pursue them even unto Thessaly, the Thessaly, I say, of utter annihilation? Put off from you, ye Lombard race, the barbarism ye have acquired, and if aught of Trojan and Latin seed yet survive in you, give heed thereto, lest when the eagle from on high, swooping down like a thunderbolt, shall descend upon you, he find his own young cast out, and the place of his offspring usurped by a brood of ravens. Up, then, ye sons of Scandinavia, and so far as ye may show yourselves eager for the presence of him whose advent ye now justly await with dread. And be not deceived by the wiles of avarice, which, with a charm as of the sirens of old, is able to destroy the vigilance of your reason. Come before his presence with confession, submitting yourselves unto him, and sing a psalm of repentance unto him with joy, remembering that whosoever resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and that whoso fighteth against the divine ordinance kicketh against a will which is as the will of the Almighty, and it is hard to kick against the pricks. But ye that groan under oppression, lift up your hearts, for your salvation is nigh at hand. Take the mattock of true humility, and break up the parched clods of your pride, making smooth the field of your minds, lest perchance the rain from heaven, coming before the seed has been sown, fall in vain from on high. Let not the grace of God be turned from you, as is the daily dew from the rock, but may ye conceive like a fertile valley, and put forth green, the green, that is, which shall be fruitful of true peace. And when your land shall be green with this verdure, the new husbandman of the Romans with greater love and more confidence shall yoke the oxen of his counsel to the plough. Forbear, forbear from henceforth, well-beloved, who with me have suffered wrong, that the shepherd descended from Hector may recognize you as sheep of his fold. For through the temporal chastisement he committed to his hands from above, yet that he may be redolent of the goodness of him, from whom, as from a point, the power of Peter and of Caesar doth bifurcate, he delighteth him in the correction of his household, but delighteth him yet more in showing them compassion. Wherefore, if ye be not hindered by that inveterate sin, which oft times like a serpent is thrown on its back, and is turned against itself, ye may hence both the one and the other of you perceive that peace is prepared for each one, and may even now taste the first fruits of the unlooked-for joy. Awake, therefore, all of you, and rise up to meet your king, ye inhabitants of Italy, as being reserved not only as subjects unto his sovereignty, but also as free peoples unto his guidance. And I urge you not only to rise up to meet him, but to stand in reverent awe before his presence, ye who drink of his streams and sail upon his seas, ye who tread the sands of the shores and the summits of the mountains that are his, ye who enjoy all public rights and possess all private property by the bond of his law, and no otherwise. Be ye not like the ignorant, deceiving your own selves, after the manner of them that dream, and say in their hearts, We have no Lord. For all within the compass of the heavens is his garden and his lake. For the sea is God's, and he made it, and his hands prepared the dry land. Wherefore it is made manifest by the wonders that have been wrought that God ordained the Roman prince beforehand, and the church confesses that he afterward confirmed him by the word of the Word. Verily, if from the creation of the world the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, and if through the things that are known those that are unknown are revealed to us, it is without doubt within the capacity of human understanding to comprehend the mover of the heavens, and his will from the motion thereof. This preordination, then, will be readily apprehended even by such as are but casual observers. For if we survey the past, from the first tiny spark of this fire, namely from the day when hospitality was denied to the Argives by the Phrygians, and, if time allow, review the events of the world's history down to the triumphs of Octavian, we shall see that certain of them have altogether transcended the highest pitch of human effort, and that God at times has wrought through man as though through new heavens. For it is not always we who act, but sometimes we are the instruments of God, and the human will, in which liberty is by nature inherent, at times receives direction untrammeled by earthly affections, and subject to the eternal will, oft-times unconsciously becomes the minister thereof. And if these things, which are, as it were, the preliminaries for the proof of what we seek, do not suffice, who is there who will not be compelled to agree with me in the conclusion drawn from such premises, namely, the fact that the whole world was wrapped in peace for 12 years, whereby is revealed as with accomplished fact the face of its syllogizer, namely, the Son of God. And he, when, after he had been made man for the revelation of the Spirit, he was preaching the gospel upon earth, as if he were dividing two kingdoms, apportioned the world to himself and to Caesar, and bade that to each should be rendered the things that are his. But if an obstinate mind does not yet assent to the truth, and demands further proof, let it consider the words of Christ when he was bound. For when Pilate asserted his power against him, our light declared that power to be from above, of which he boasted who was exercising the office of Caesar by vicarious authority. Walk ye not, therefore, as the Gentiles walk, but in the vanity of their senses, shrouded in darkness. But open ye the eyes of your mind, and behold how the Lord of heaven and of earth hath appointed us a king. This is he whom Peter, the vicar of God, exhorts us to honor, and whom Clement, the present successor of Peter, illumines with the light of the apostolic benediction, that, where the spiritual race suffices not, there the splendor of the lesser luminary may lend.
Chapter 6 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Early, Brisbane, Australia. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Page Toynbee. Epistola VI to the Florentines, March 31st, 1311. Dante Alighieri, a Florentine undeservedly in exile, to the most iniquitous Florentines within the city. The gracious providence of the eternal King, who in his goodness overrules the affairs of the world above, yet ceases not to look down upon our concerns here below, committed to the Holy Roman Empire the governance of human affairs, to the end that mankind might repose in the peace of so powerful a protection, and everywhere, as nature demands, might live as citizens of an ordered world. And though the proof of this is to be found in the Holy Writ, and though the ancients, relying on reason alone, bear witness thereto, yet it is no small confirmation of the truth, that when the throne of Augustus is vacant, the whole world goes out of course, the helmsmen and rowers slumber in the ship of Peter, and unhappy Italy, forsaken and abandoned to private control, and bereft of all public guidance, is tossed with such buffeting of wind and waves as no words can describe, nay, as even the Italians in their woe can scarce measure with their tears. Wherefore, let all who in mad presumption have risen up against this most manifest will of God now grow pale at the thought of the judgment of the stern judge, which is nigh at hand, if so be the sword of him who saith, Vengeance is mine, be not fallen out of heaven. But you, who transgress every law of God and man, and whom this insatiable greed of avarice has urged all too willing into every crime, does the dread of the second death not haunt you, seeing that you first, and you alone, shrinking from the yoke of liberty, have murmured against the glory of the Roman Emperor, the King of the earth, and minister of God, and under cover of prescriptive right, refusing the duty of submission due to him, have chosen rather to rise up in the madness of rebellion. Have you to learn, senseless and perverse as you are, that public right can be subject to no reckoning by prescription, but must endure so long as time itself endures? Verily the sacred precepts of the law declare, and human reason after inquiry has decided, that public control of affairs, however long neglected, can never become of no effect, nor be superseded, however much it be weakened. For nothing which tends to the advantage of all can be destroyed, or even impaired, without injury to all, a thing contrary to the intention of God and nature, and which would be utterly abhorrent to the opinion of all mankind. Wherefore then, being disabused of such an idle conceit, do you abandon the Holy Empire, and, like the men of Babel once more, seek to found new kingdoms, so that there shall be one polity of Florence, and another of Rome? And why should not the apostolic government be the object of a like envy, so that, if the one twin of Delos have her double in the heavens, the other should have his likewise? But if reflection upon your evil designs bring you no fears, at least let this strike terror into your hardened hearts, that as the penalty for your crime not only wisdom, but the beginning of wisdom, has been taken from you. For no condition of the sinner is more terrible than that of him who, shamelessly and without the fear of God, does whatsoever he lists. Full often, indeed, the wicked man is smitten with this judgment, that as during life he has been oblivious of God, so when he dies he is rendered oblivious of himself. But if your insolent arrogance has so deprived you of the dew from on high, like the mountain tops of Gilboa, that you have not feared to resist the decree of the eternal Senate, and have felt no fear at not having feared, shall that deadly fear, to wit, human and worldly fear, not overwhelm you, when the inevitable shipwreck of your proud race, and the speedy end of your deeply to be rude lawlessness, shall be seen to be hard at hand? Do you put your trust in defences, in that you are girt about by a contemptible rampart? O you of one mind only for evil, O you blinded by wondrous greed! What shall it avail you to have girt you with a rampart, and to have fortified yourselves with bulwarks and battlements, when, terrible in gold, the eagles shall swoop down upon you, which, soaring now over the Pyrenees, now over Caucasus, now over Atlas, ever strengthened by the support of the host of heaven, gazed down of old on the vast expanse of ocean in its flight? What shall these avail you, most wretched of men, when you stand confounded in the presence of him who shall subdue the raging of Hesperia. The hopes which you vainly cherish in your unreason will not be furthered by your rebellion, but by this resistance the just wrath of the king at his coming will be but the more inflamed against you, and mercy, which ever accompanies his army, shall fly away indignant. And where you think to defend the threshold of false liberty, there in sooth shall you fall into the dungeon of slavery. For by the wondrous judgment of God, as we must believe, it sometimes comes to pass that by the very means whereby the wicked man thinks to escape the punishment which is his due, he is the more fatally hurried into it, and that he who wittingly and willingly is a rebel against the divine will, is unwittingly and unwillingly a soldier in its service. The buildings which you have raised, not in prudence to serve your needs, but have recklessly altered to gratify your wantonness, these, encircled by no walls of a renovated Troy, to your grief you shall see crumble beneath the battering ram, and devoured by the flames. The populace which now, divided against itself, rages indiscriminately, some for you, some against you, you shall then see united in their imprecations against you, for the starving mob knows nothing of fear. With remorse, too, you shall behold the spoliation of your temples, thronged daily by a concourse of matrons, and your children doomed in wonder and ignorance to suffer for the sins of their fathers. And if my prophetic soul be not deceived, which announces what it has been taught by infallible signs and incontrovertible arguments, your city, worn out with ceaseless mourning, shall be delivered at the last into the hands of the stranger, after the greatest part of you has been destroyed in death or captivity, and the few that shall be left to endure exile shall witness her downfall with tears and lamentation. Those sufferings, in short, which for liberty's sake the glorious city of Saguntum endured in her loyalty, you in your disloyalty must undergo with shame but to become slaves. And beware of gathering confidence from the unlooked-for success of the men of Parma, who under the spur of hunger, that evil counsellor, murmuring to one another, "Let us rather rush into the midst of battle and meet death," broke into the camp of Caesar while Caesar was absent. For even they, though they gained a victory over Victoria, none the less reaped woe from that woe in a way not like to be forgotten. But bethink you of the thunderbolts of the first Frederick. Consider the fate of Milan and of Spoleto, for at the remembrance of their disobedience and swift overthrow, your too swollen flesh shall grow chill, and your too hot hearts shall contract. O most foolish of the Tuscans, insensate alike by nature and by corruption, who neither consider nor understand in your ignorance how before the eyes of the full-fledged the feet of your diseased minds go astray in the darkness of night. For the full-fledged and undefiled in the way behold you standing as it were on the threshold of the prison, and thrusting aside any that has pity on you, lest haply he should deliver you from your captivity, and loose you from the chains that bind your hands and feet. Nor are ye ware in your blindness of the overmastering greed which beguiles you with venomous whispers, and with cheating threats constrains you, yea, and has brought you into captivity to the law of sin, and forbidden you to obey the most sacred laws. Those laws made in the likeness of natural justice, the observance whereof, if it be joyous, if it be free, is not only no servitude, but to him who observes with understanding is manifestly in itself the most perfect liberty. For what else is this liberty but the free passage from will to act, which the laws make easy for those who obey them? Seeing then that they are only free who of their own will submit to the law, what do you call yourselves? who, while you make pretence of a love of liberty, in defiance of every law, conspire against the prince, who is the giver of the law. O most wretched offshoot of Fiesole! O barbarians, punished now a second time! Does the foretaste not suffice to terrify you? Of a truth I believe that, for all you simulate hope in your looks and lying lips, yet you tremble in your waking hours, and ever start from your dreams in terror at the portents which have visited you, or rehearsing again the counsels you have debated by day. But if, while alarmed with good reason, you repent you of your madness, yet feel no remorse, then, that the streams of fear and remorse may unite in the bitter waters of repentance, bear this further in mind, that the guardian of the Roman Empire, the triumphant Henry, elect of God, thirsting not for his own but for the public good, has for our sakes undertaken his heavy task, sharing our pains of his own free will, as though to him, after Christ, the prophet Isaiah had pointed the finger of prophecy, when by the revelation of the Spirit of God he declared, "Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows." Wherefore you perceive, if you not be dissemblers, that the hour of bitter repentance for your mad presumption is now at hand. But a late repentance after this wise will not purchase pardon. Rather it is but the prelude to seasonable chastisement. For the sinner is smitten, so that he shall surely die. Written from beneath the springs of Arno, on the confines of Tuscany, on the 31st day of March, in the first year of the most auspicious passage.
Chapter 7 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri, translated by Paget Toynbee. Epistolae 7 to the Emperor Henry VII, April 17, 1311. To the most glorious and most fortunate conqueror and sole Lord, the Lord Henry, by divine providence, King of the Romans and ever Augustus, his most devoted servants, Dante Alighieri, a Florentine undeservedly in exile, and all the Tuscans everywhere who desire peace, offer a kiss on the ground before his feet. As the boundless love of God bears witness, the heritage of peace was left to us, that in its wondrous sweetness the hardships of our warfare might be softened, and that by its practice we might earn the joys of the triumphant fatherland. But the envy of the ancient and implacable enemy, who ever secretly plots against the prosperity of mankind, having dispossessed some of their own free will, has, owing to the absence of our guardian, impiously stripped us others against our will. Wherefore we have long wept by the waters of confusion, and unceasingly prayed for the protection of the just king, who should destroy the satellites of the cruel tyrant, and should stablish us again under our own justice. But when thou, the successor of Caesar and Augustus, o'erleaping the ridge of the Apennines, didst bring back the venerated Tarpeian standards, forthwith our deep sighing was stayed, and the flood of our tears was dried up, and like the rising of the long-awaited sun, a new hope of a better age shone abroad upon Italy. Then many, going before their wishes in their joy, sang with Maro of the reign of Saturn and of the return of the Virgin. But because our sun, whether it be the fervour of our longing or the appearance of truth which suggests it, is believed to be tarrying, or is suspected to be turning back, as though at the bidding once again of Joshua or of the son of Amos, we are constrained in our uncertainty to doubt, and to break forth in the words of the forerunner, "Art thou he that should come, or look we for another?" And though prolonged desire, as is its wont, turns into doubt in its frenzy things which, owing to their being close at hand, seem to be certain, nevertheless we believe and hope in thee, declaring thee to be the minister of God, the Son of the Church, and the furtherer of the glory of Rome. For I too, who write as well for myself as for others, beheld thee most gracious, and heard thee most clement, as beseems imperial majesty, when my hands touched thy feet, and my lips paid their tribute. Then my spirit rejoiced within me, when I secretly said within myself, Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sins of the world. But we marvel what sluggishness holds thee so long, in that long since victor in the valley of Po, thou dost abandon, pass by, and neglect Tuscany, not otherwise than as if thou didst suppose the imperial rights entrusted to thy guardianship to be limited by the boundaries of Liguria, forgetting in sooth, as we apprehend, that the glorious dominion of the Romans is confined neither by the frontiers of Italy nor by the coastline of three-cornered Europe. For although it has been constrained by violence to narrow the bounds of its government, yet by indefeasible right it everywhere stretches as far as the waves of Amphitrite, and scarce deigns to be circumscribed by the ineffectual waters of ocean. For it is written for our behoof, From the fair line of Troy a Caesar shall be born, who shall bound his empire by the ocean, his glory by the stars. And when Augustus decreed that all the world should be taxed, as the lowing of our evangelical ox, aglow with the flame of the eternal fire records, if the decree had not issued from the court of a most just prince, in vain would the only begotten Son of God, made man, in order to the declaring himself subject to the edict, in accordance with the nature he had assumed, have willed to be born of the Virgin at that time, for he, whom it behoved to fulfill all righteousness, would not have counselled an unrighteous act. Let him, then, for whom the whole world is longing, be ashamed to be entangled so long in such a narrow corner of the world, and let it not escape the consideration of Augustus that the tyrant of Tuscany is encouraged by the assurance that he is delaying, and daily by appealing to the pride of the evildoers gathers fresh strength, heaping daring upon daring. Let the voice of Curio to Caesar be heard once again. While the factions are in confusion and without support, away with delay. Delay was ever the bane of the ready. Equal toil and fear are more dearly bought. Once again let the voice of Mercury chiding Aeneas be heard. If the glory of such mighty deeds leave thee unmoved, and thou wilt not exert thyself for thine own fame's sake, yet consider the young Ascanius, Iulius, thine hope and heir, to whom are due the kingdom of Italy and the land of the Romans. For John, thy royal firstborn, the king whom, after the setting of the day which is now rising, the succeeding generation of the world awaits as their ruler, is to us as the second Ascanius, who, following in the footsteps of his great sire, shall rage like a lion against the followers of Turnus, wheresoever they be, and towards the followers of Latinus shall be as gentle as a lamb. Let the lofty counsels of the most sacred king take heed, lest the judgment from on high renew the bitter words of Samuel. When thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made head of the tribes of Israel? And the Lord anointed thee king over Israel. And the Lord sent thee on a journey, and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners the Amalekites. For thou likewise hast been anointed king, that thou mayest smite Amalek, and not spare Agag. and mayest avenge him that sent thee on the brutal people, and their over-hasty rejoicing, which things verily Amalek and Agag are said to signify. Through the spring as through the winter dost thou linger at Milan, thinking to extirpate the pestiferous hydra by cutting off its heads? But if thou hadst turned thy thoughts back to the mighty deeds of the glorious Alcides, thou wouldst perceive that thou, like him, art deceiving thyself. For the noisome beast, as its ever-multiplying head sprouted again, grew stronger through the loss, until the hero in good earnest attacked the seat of life itself. For to destroy a tree, the mere lopping of branches is of no avail. Nay, the noxious growth will but come again the more thickly, so long as the roots are uninjured and can supply nourishment. What dost thou, the sole ruler of the world, imagine thou wilt have accomplished when thou hast set thy foot upon the neck of rebellious Cremona? Will not some unlooked-for madness next break out at Brescia or at Pavia? Yea, and when this has been chastised and has subsided, presently another will break out at Vercelli or at Bergamo, or elsewhere, until the root cause of this exuberance be removed, and, the root of all the mischief being plucked up, the spiny branches shall wither together with the trunk. Dost thou not know, most excellent prince, and canst thou not descry from the watch-tower of thine exalted highness where that stinking vixen has her lair, undisturbed by the hunters? Verily, the culprit drinks neither of the headlong Po, nor of thine own Tiber, but her jaws pollute even now the rushing stream of Arno and Florence. Canst thou be unaware? Florence is the name of this baleful pest. She is the viper that turns against the vitals of her own mother. She is the sick sheep that infects the flock of her lord with her contagion. She is the abandoned and unnatural Myrrha, inflamed with passion for the embraces of her father Cinyras. She is the passionate Amata, who, rejecting the fated marriage, did not shrink from claiming for herself a son-in-law whom the fates denied her, but in her madness urged him to battle, and at the last, in expiation for her evil designs, hanged herself in the noose. Verily, with the ferocity of a viper, she strives to rend her mother, when she sharpens the horns of rebellion against Rome, which made her in her own image and after her own likeness. Verily, she exhales pestilential fumes from the reek of corruption, whence the neighbouring flocks all unknowing waste away, when by the lure of lying blandishments and deceit she wins over to herself those on her borders, and having won them, deprives them of their senses. Verily, she burns for the embraces of her own father, when she wickedly and wantonly seeks to compass a breach between thee and the supreme pontiff, who is the father of fathers. Verily, she resists the ordinance of God, worshipping the idol of her own will, when, spurning her rightful king, she is not ashamed, mad as she is, to barter rights not her own with a king not her own for the power to do evil. But let the infuriate woman take heed to the noose wherein she is entangling herself. For ofttimes such a one is given over to a reprobate mind, to the end that when so given over he may do those things which are not convenient. For though the deeds be unjust, yet as retribution they are seen to be just. Up then, make an end of delay, thou new scion of Jesse, and take confidence from the eyes of the Lord God of hosts, in whose sight thou strivest, and overthrow this Goliath with the sling of thy wisdom and with the stone of thy strength, for at his fall night and the shadow of fear shall cover the camp of the Philistines. The Philistines shall flee, and Israel shall be delivered. Then our heritage which was taken away, and for which we lament without ceasing, shall be restored to us whole again. But even as now, remembering the most holy Jerusalem, we mourn as exiles in Babylon, so then, as citizens and breathing in peace, we shall think with joy on the miseries of confusion. Written in Tuscany, from beneath the springs of Arno, on the 17th day of April, in the first
Chapter 8 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. Epistola VIII. To the Empress Margaret, April 1311. To the most glorious and most clement Lady, the Lady Margaret, by divine providence Queen of the Romans and ever Augusta, G.D. Battifolle, by the grace of God and his allied magnificence Countess Palatine in Tuscany, makes humble offering of her dutiful and devoted submissions. The most welcome letter of your royal benignity was beheld with joy by my eyes, and with becoming reverence was received into my hands. And when the purport thereof penetrated the recesses of my mind with its sweetness, my heart as I read glowed with so great fervour of devotion as oblivion can never extinguish, nor memory recall without delight. For who and what am I, that the most potent spouse of Caesar should condescend to inform me as to the well-being, which long may it endure, of her consort and of herself? Verily the weight of so great an honour neither the deserts nor the dignity of her who greets you could look for. Yet was it not unseemly that the pinnacle of the ranks of human society should thus incline itself, since from hence, as from a living fountain, the exemplars of sacred civilization must be transmitted to those below. To return adequate thanks is beyond the power of man, but I deem it to be not unnatural for man sometimes to make prayer to God for help in his insufficiency. Now therefore let the court of the starry realm be assailed with just and holy prayers, and may the seal of suppliant obtain that the eternal ruler of the world may recompense so great a condescension with proportionate reward, and may stretch forth the right hand of his grace in furtherance of the hopes of Caesar and of Augusta, to the end that he, who for the safeguard of mankind brought under the empire of the Roman prince all peoples barbarian and civilized, may by the triumph and glory of his Chapter 9 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. Epistola IX. To the Empress Margaret, April or May, 1311. To the most serene and most gracious Lady, the Lady Margaret, by the merciful dispensation of Heaven, Queen of the Romans and ever Augusta, her most devoted servant, G.D. Battifolle, by the bountiful grace of God, and of the Empire Countess Palatine in Tuscany, on her humbly bended knees presents her dutiful respects. I received the favour of your royal letter with all possible reverence, and studied its contents with devotion. But when I perused your friendly intimation as to the prosperous issue of your most auspicious progress, with what great joy my heart was gladdened by the perusal! I prefer to commend to silence, as to a more competent messenger; for words are not adequate as a means of expression when the mind itself is overcome, as it were with inebriation. May then the understanding of your Royal Highness supply what the humility of your correspondent is not able to convey. But although the news contained in your letters was unspeakably welcome and pleasing, yet a larger hope both heaps up fresh causes for rejoicing, and already sees the fulfilment of its just aspirations. I indeed hope, confiding in the providence of Heaven, which, as I firmly believe, can never be deceived, nor be hindered of its purpose, and which has provided for civilized mankind on the sole Prince, that the happy inauguration of your reign may be confirmed by ever-increasing prosperity. Exulting therefore in the present, as in the future, without hesitation I commit myself to the clemency of Augusta, and humbly make early supplication that you may deign to place me in safe keeping beneath your Eminence's shadow, in such wise that I may ever be, and may be Chapter 10 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. Epistola 10. To the Empress Margaret, May 11, 1311. To the most illustrious and most gracious Lady, the Lady Margaret, by divine providence Queen of the Romans and ever Augusta, her most faithful servant G. D. Battifol, by the grace of God and of the imperial indulgence Countess Palatine in Tuscany, with most zealous devotion offers herself, and her willing service to command. When the letter of your Serenity came before the eyes of her who writes and sends this greeting, my sincere devotion proved in what measure the hearts of devoted servants are made glad by the happy fortunes of their lords. For from the contents of your letter I gathered with the most complete rejoicing of heart how the right hand of the Most High King was auspiciously bringing about the accomplishment of the wishes of Caesar and of Augusta. Having then made proof of the measure of my devotion, I now make bold to assume the part of petitioner. Supplicating therefore the attention of your Eminence, I humbly beg and earnestly beseech that you may deign to examine with the eyes of your mind the sincerity of the devotion of which I have spoken. But whereas a sentence in the royal letter seemed to urge that, should the opportunity of a messenger occur, I should furnish to your Royal Highness, agreeably to my fervent desire, some particulars as to the condition of my circumstances, although a certain appearance of presumption would forbid me, yet under the suasion of the virtue of obedience I will obey. May it please the gracious and serene Majesty of the Romans to learn, since such is her command, that at the moment of the dispatch of these presents, my beloved husband and myself, by the gift of God, were prospering and in good health, rejoicing in the welfare of our children, and more than usually joyful in that the omens of the reviving fortunes of the imperial cause were already given promise of more happy times to come. Dispatched from the castle of Poppy on 18th of May,
Chapter 11 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante by Dante Alighieri, translated by Paget Toynbee. To the Italian Cardinals, Dante of Florence, etc. How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? She is become as a widow that was great among the nations. The greed aforetime of the chiefs of the Pharisees, which made the ancient priesthood an abomination, not only did away the ministry of the children of Levi, but moreover brought siege and destruction on the chosen city of David. And when he, who alone is eternal, beheld this thing from his eternal watchtower on high, by his Holy Spirit he laid his command upon the mind worthy of God of a man that was a prophet. And in the words above written, alas, too often repeated, lamented over holy Jerusalem as a city undone. We too, who confess the same Father and Son, the same God and man, yea, the same Mother and Virgin, we for whose sake and for whose salvation thrice was the question repeated concerning love, and it was said, Peter, feed my sheep, that is to say, the sacred fold, Rome, to which, after so many triumphs and glories, Christ by word and deed confirmed the empire of the world, that Rome, which the same Peter and Paul the preacher to the Gentiles, by the sprinkling of their own blood, consecrated as the apostolic see, over her, widowed and abandoned, we, who come not after the woes we have to bewail, but now mourn in consequence of them, are like Jeremiah constrained to lament. It grieves us, alas, no less to witness the lamentable plague of heresies than that the fomenters of impiety, Jews, Saracens, and Gentiles, make a mock of our Sabbaths, and, as is said, cry out, where is their God? And that, perchance, the renegade powers ascribe this to their own wiles against the protecting angels. And, more horrible still, certain readers of the stars and ignorant prophets declare that to be of necessity, which you, making ill use of your freedom of will, have preferred of your own choice. But you, who are, as it were, the centurions of the front rank of the church militant, neglecting to guide the chariot of the spouse of the crucified along the track which lay before you, have gone astray from the track, no otherwise than as the false charioteer Phaethon. And you, whose duty it was to enlighten the flock that follows you through the forest on its pilgrimage here below, have brought it along with yourselves to the verge of the precipice. Nor do I recount examples for your imitation, seeing that you turn your backs, not your faces, to the car of the spouse, and verily might be likened to them that were shown to the prophet with their backs turned towards the temple. You who scorn the fire sent down from heaven upon the altars, which now are alight with strange fire. You who sell doves in the temple, where that which cannot be measured by price is made merchandise, to the hurt of them that come and go therein. But give heed to the scourge, give heed to the fire, and make not light of the patience of him who awaits your repentance. But if you doubt as to the precipice whereof I have spoken, what else can I answer to enlighten you but that, like Demetrius, you have consented unto Alcimus? Perchance, in indignant rebuke, you will ask, and who is this man who, not fearing the sudden punishment of Uzzah, sets himself up to protect the ark, tottering though it be? Verily, I am one of the least of the sheep of the pasture of Jesus Christ. Verily, I abuse no pastoral authority, seeing that I possess no riches. By the grace, therefore, not of riches, but of God, I am what I am, and the zeal of his house hath eaten me up. For even from the mouth of babes and sucklings has been heard the truth well-pleasing to God, and he who was born blind confessed the truth, which the Pharisees not only concealed, but in their malice even strove to pervert. These are the justification for my boldness. And besides these, I have the authority of the philosopher, who in his system of morals taught the truth is to be preferred even before friendship. Nor does the presumption of Uzzah, which some may think should be laid to my charge, infect me, as though I had been rash in my utterance with the taint of his guilt. For he gave heed to the ark, I to the unruly oxen that are dragging it away into the wilderness. May he give succor to the ark, who opened his eyes to bring salvation to the laboring ship. It seems, then, that I have provoked no one to railing, but rather that I have kindled the blush of confusion in you and in others, chief priests in name only, if so be that shame has not been wholly rooted out throughout the world, since among so many who usurp the office of shepherd, among so many sheep who, if not driven away, at least are neglected and left untended in the pastures, one voice alone, one alone of filial piety, and that of a private individual, is heard at the obsequies, as it were, of Mother Church. And what wonder? Each one has taken avarice to wife, even as you yourselves have done. Avarice, the mother never of piety and righteousness, but ever of impiety and unrighteousness. Ah, most loving Mother, spouse of Christ, that by water and the Spirit bearest sons unto thy shame! Not Charity, not Estrella, but the daughters of the horseleech have become thy daughters-in-law. And what offspring they bear thee, all save the Bishop of Luni bear witness. Your Gregory lies among the cobwebs, Ambrose lies forgotten in the cupboards of the clergy, and Augustine along with him, and Dionysius, Damascenus, and Bede, and they cry up, instead I know not what Speculum and Innocent and him of Ostia. And why not? Those sought after God as their end and highest good, these get for themselves riches and benefices. But, my fathers, suppose not that I am a phoenix in the wide world, for everyone is murmuring, or muttering, or thinking, or dreaming what I cry aloud, but they do not testify to what they have seen. Some there are who remain lost in wonder, but will they forever hold their peace, nor bear witness to their Maker? The Lord liveth, for he who moved the tongue of Balaam's ass, he is the Lord also of the brutes of today. Now I am constrained to lift up my voice. Ye have compelled me. Be ye therefore ashamed to receive rebuke and admonishment from so lowly a source, and not from heaven, which may pardon you. In the right fashion indeed are we dealt with when we are smitten on that side by which shame can reach our hearing, as well as the rest of our senses, and beget in us repentance, her firstborn, who in turn shall give birth to purpose of amendment. And that a glorious patience may foster and maintain this purpose, it behooves you to keep before the eyes of your mind, according to the measure of your imagination, the present condition of the city of Rome, a sight to move the pity even of Hannibal, not to say others, bereft as she now is of the one and the other of her luminaries, and sitting solitary and widowed, as is written above. And this most chiefly is the concern of you who have known sacred Tiber as little children. For although it is the duty of all Italians to love the capital of Italy as the common source of their civility, yet is it justly held to be your part most especially to reverence it, since for you it is the source also of your very being. And if at the present time misery has consumed with grief and confounded with shame the rest of the inhabitants of Italy, who can doubt but that you must blush with shame, and must grieve, who have been the cause of so unwonted an eclipse of Rome, or rather of her sun? Thou above all, Orsini, that thy colleagues who have been degraded should not continue forever stripped of their glory, and they that by the authority of the apostolic head they should resume the venerable insignia of the church militant, which, not as perchance having completed their service, but undeservedly they were compelled to lay down. Thou also, the adherent of the other Transteverine faction, in order that the wrath of the deceased pontiff might put forth leaves in thee, like a branch engrafted on a trunk not its own, as if thou hadst not yet put off the Carthage that was conquered of old, couldst thou, without the reproof of thy better judgment, prefer this purpose before the country of the illustrious Scipios? There will be amendment. However, although it cannot be but that the scar of infamy will disfigure with its mark the apostolic see even until the fire for which the heavens that now are and the earth have been reserved, if you all, who were the authors of this deviation from the track, with one accord shall fight manfully for the spouse of Christ, for the seat of the spouse, which is Rome, for our Italy, and, to speak more at large, for the whole body politic now in pilgrimage on earth, so that from the wrestling ground, surveyed on every side from the shores of ocean, of the contest that is already begun, offering yourselves with glory, you may be able to hear glory in the highest, and that the reproach of the Gascons, who, burning with abominable lust, strive to usurp for themselves the glory of the Italians, may be an example to posterity for all ages.
Chapter 12 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary J. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. Epistola XII. To a friend in Florence, May 1315. From your letter, which I received with due respect and affection, and have diligently studied, I learn with gratitude how my recall to Florence has been the object of your care and concern, and I am the more beholden to you therefore, inasmuch as it rarely happens that an exile finds friends. My reply to what you have written, although perchance it be not of such tenor as certain faint hearts would desire, I earnestly beg may be carefully examined and considered by you before judgment be passed upon it. I gather then from the letter of your nephew and mine, as well as from those of sundry other friends, that, by the terms of a decree lately promulgated in Florence touching the pardon of the exiles, I may receive pardon, and be permitted to return forthwith, on condition that I pay a certain sum of money, and submit to the stigma of the oblation. 2 propositions, my father, which in sooth are as ridiculous as they are ill-advised. Ill-advised, that is to say, on the part of those who have communicated them, for in your letter, which was more discreetly and cautiously formulated, no hint of such condition was conveyed. This, then, is the gracious recall of Dante Alighieri to his native city, after the miseries of well-nigh 15 years of exile. This is the reward of innocence manifest to all the world, and of the sweat and toil of unremitting study. Far be from a familiar of philosophy such a senseless act of abasement as to submit himself to be presented at the oblation, like a felon in bonds, as one Cholo and other infamous wretches have done. Far be it from the preacher of justice, after suffering wrong, to pay of his money to those that wronged him, as though they had deserved well of him. No, my father, not by this path will I return to my native city. If some other can be found, in the first place by yourself and thereafter by others, which does not derogate from the fame and honour of Dante, that will I tread with no lagging steps. But if by no such path Florence may be entered, then will I enter Florence never. What, can I not anywhere gaze upon the face of the sun and the stars? Can I not under any sky contemplate the most precious truths, without I first return to Florence, disgraced Chapter 13 of Epistolae, the Letters of Dante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary J. Epistolae, the Letters of Dante, by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Paget Toynbee. Epistola XIII, to Cangran della Scala, circa 1319. To the magnificent and most victorious Lord, the Lord Cangran della Scala, Vicar General of the most holy Principality of Caesar in the city of Verona, and town of Vicenza, his most devoted servant, Dante Alighieri, a Florentine by birth, not by disposition, prayeth long and happy life, and perpetual increase of the glory of his name. The illustrious renown of your magnificence, which wakeful fame spreads abroad as she flies, affects diverse persons in diverse ways, so that some it uplifts with the hope of good fortune, while others it casts down with the dread of destruction. The report whereof, overtopping all deeds of recent times, I erstwhile did deem extravagant, as going beyond the appearance of truth. But that continued uncertainty might not keep me longer in suspense, even as the Queen of the South sought Jerusalem, and as Pallas sought Helicon, so did I seek Verona, in order to examine with my own trusty eyes the things of which I had heard. And there was I witness of your splendor. There was I witness and partaker of your bounty, and whereas I had formerly suspected the reports to be somewhat unmeasured, I afterwards recognized that it was the facts themselves that were beyond measure. Whence it came to pass that whereas, through hearsay alone, with a certain subjection of mind, I had previously become well disposed towards you, at the first sight of you I became your most devoted servant and friend. Nor do I think that in assuming the name of friend I shall lay myself open to a charge of presumption, as some perchance might object, inasmuch as unequals no less than equals are united by the sacred tie of friendship. For if one should examine friendships which have been pleasant and profitable, it will be evident that in many cases the bond has been between persons of superior station and their inferiors. And if our attention be directed to true friendship for its own sake, shall we not find that the friends of illustrious and mighty princes have many a time been men obscure in condition, but of distinguished virtue? Why not? Since even the friendship of God and man is in no wise impeded by the disparity between them. But if any man consider this assertion unseemly, let him hearken to the Holy Spirit when it declares that certain men have been partakers of its friendship. For in wisdom we read, concerning wisdom, for she is a treasure unto men that never faileth, which they that use are made partakers of the friendship of God. But the common herd in their ignorance judge without discernment, and even as they imagine the sun to be a foot across, so they judge with regard to questions of conduct, and they are deceived by their foolish credulity with regard to both the one and the other matter. But it does not become us, to whom it has been given to know what is best in our nature, to follow in the footsteps of the common herd. Nay, rather are we bound to oppose their errors. For those who have vigor of intellect and reason, being endowed with a certain divine liberty, are not restricted by precedent. Nor is this to be wondered at, for it is not they who receive discretion from the laws, but rather the laws from them. It is manifest, therefore, that what I said above, namely, that I was your most devoted servant and friend, in no wise savours of presumption. Esteeming, then, your friendship as the most precious treasure, I desire to preserve it with assiduous forethought and anxious care. Therefore, since it is a doctrine of ethics that friendship is equalized and preserved by reciprocity, it is my wish to preserve due reciprocity in making a return for the bounty more than once conferred upon me, for which reason I have often and long examined such poor gifts as I can offer, and have set them out separately, and scrutinized each in turn, in order to decide which would be the most worthy and the most acceptable to you. And I have found nothing more suitable even for your exalted station than the sublime cantica of the comedy, which is adorned with the title of Paradise. This, then, dedicated to yourself, with the present letter to serve as its superscription, I inscribe, offer, and, in fine, commend to you. Nor does the simple ardor of my affection permit me to pass over in silence the consideration that in this offering there may seem to be greater honor and fame conferred on the patron than on the gift. the rather that in the address I shall appear to such as read with attention, to have given utterance to a forecast as to the increase of the glory of your name, in this of set purpose. But eagerness for your favour, for which I thirst, heedless of envy, will urge me forward to the goal, which was my aim from the first. And so, having made an end of what I had to say in epistolary form, I will now, in the capacity of commentator, essay a few words by way of introduction to the work which is offered for your acceptance. As the philosopher says in the second book of the Metaphysics, as a thing is in respect of being, so is it in respect of truth. The reason of which is that the truth concerning a thing, which consists in the truth as in its subject, is the perfect likeness of the thing as it is. Now of things which exist, some are such as to have absolute being in themselves, while others are such as to have their being dependent upon something else, by virtue of a certain relation, as being in existence at the same time, or having respect to some other thing, as in the case of correlatives, such as father and son, master and servant, double and half, the part and whole, and other similar things, in so far as they are related. Inasmuch, then, as the being of such things depends upon something else, it follows that the truth of these things likewise depends upon something else. For if the half is unknown, its double cannot be known, and so of the rest. If any one, therefore, is desirous of offering any sort of introduction to a part of a work, it behoves him to furnish some notion of the whole, of which it is a part. Wherefore I too, being desirous of offering something by way of introduction to the above-mentioned part of the whole comedy, thought it incumbent on me, in the first place, to say something concerning the work as a whole, in order that access to the part might be the easier and more perfect. There are 6 points, then, as to which inquiry must be made at the beginning of every didactic work, namely the subject, the author, the form, the aim, the title of the book, and the branch of philosophy to which it belongs. Now of these 6 points, there are 3 in respect of which the part which I have had in mind to address to you differs from the whole work, namely the subject, the form, and the title, whereas in respect of the others there is no difference, as is obvious to anyone who considers the matter. Consequently, in an examination of the whole, these 3 points must be made the subject of a separate inquiry, which being done, the way will be sufficiently clear for the introduction to the part. Later we will examine the other 3 points, not only with reference to the whole work, but also with reference to the particular part which is offered to you. For the elucidation, therefore, of what we have to say, it must be understood that the meaning of this work is not of one kind only. Rather, the work may be described as polysemous, that is, having several meanings. For the first meaning is that which is conveyed by the letter, and the next is that which is conveyed by what the letter signifies, the former of which is called the literal, while the latter is called allegorical or mystical. And for the better illustration of this method of exposition, we may apply it to the following verses. When Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah was his sanctuary, and Israel his dominion. For if we consider the letter alone, the thing signified to us is the going out of the children of Israel from Egypt in the time of Moses. If the allegory, our redemption through Christ is signified. If the moral sense, the conversion of the soul from the sorrow and misery of sin to a state of grace is signified. If the anagogical, the passing of the sanctified soul from the bondage of the corruption of this world to the liberty of everlasting glory is signified. And although these mystical meanings are called by various names, they may, one and all, in a general sense, be termed allegorical, inasmuch as they are different from the literal or historical. For the word allegory is so called from the Greek alleion, which in Latin is alienum, strange, or diversum, different. This being understood, it is clear that the subject with regard to which the alternative meanings are brought into play must be twofold. And therefore the subject of this work must be considered in the first place from the point of view of the literal meaning, and next from that of the allegorical interpretation. The subject, then, of the whole work, taken in the literal sense only, is the state of souls after death, pure and simple. For on and about that the argument of the whole work turns. If, however, the work be regarded from the allegorical point of view, the subject is man, according as by his merits or demerits, in the exercise of his free will, he is deserving of reward or punishment by justice. And the form is twofold, the form of the treatise and the form of the treatment. The form of the treatise is threefold, according to the threefold division. The first division is that whereby the whole work is divided into 3 canticae, the second whereby each cantica is divided into cantos, and the third whereby each canto is divided into rhymed lines. The former manner of treatment is poetic, fictive, descriptive, digressive, and figurative, and further it is definitive, analytical, probative, refutative, and exemplicative. The title of the book is Here Begins the Comedy of Dante Alighieri, a Florentine by birth, not by disposition, for the understanding of which it must be noted that comedy is so called from comos, a village, and oda, a song, whence comedy is, as it were, a rustic song. Now comedy is a certain kind of poetical narration which differs from all others. It differs then from tragedy in its subject matter, in that tragedy at the beginning is admirable and placid, but at the end or issue is foul and horrible. In tragedy is so called from thragos, a goat, and oda, as it were, a goat song, that is to say, foul like a goat, as appears from the tragedies of Seneca, whereas comedy begins with sundry adverse conditions, but ends happily, as appears from the comedies of Terence. And for this reason it is the custom of some writers in their salutation to say by way of greeting, "A tragic beginning and a comic ending to you." Tragedy and comedy differ likewise in their style of language, for that of tragedy is high-flown and sublime, while that of comedy is unstudied and lowly, and this is implied by Horace in The Art of Poetry, where he grants that the comedian may on occasion use the language of tragedy and vice versa. Yet sometimes comedy her voice will raise, and angry cremes scold with swelling phrase, and prosy periods oft our ears assail, when Telephus and Peleus tell their tragic tale. And from this it is clear that the present work is to be described as a comedy, for if we consider the subject matter, at the beginning it is horrible and foul, as being hell, but at the close it is happy, desirable, and pleasing, as being paradise. As regards the style of language, the style is unstudied and lowly, as being in the vulgar tongue, in which even women-folk hold their talk. And hence it is evident why the work is called a comedy. And there are other kinds of poetical narration, such as the pastoral poem, the elegy, the satire, and the votive song, as may also be gathered from Horace in The Art of Poetry. But of these we need say nothing at present. It can now be shown in what manner the subject of the part offered to you is to be determined. For if the subject of the whole work, taken in the literal sense, is the state of souls after death, pure and simple, without limitation, it is evident that in this part the same state is the subject, but with a limitation, namely, the state of the blessed souls after death. And if the subject of the whole work, from the allegorical point of view, is man according as by his merits or demerits in the exercise of his free will he is deserving of reward or punishment by justice, it is evident that in this part this subject has a limitation, in that it is man according as by his merits he is deserving of reward by justice. In like manner the form of the part is determined by that of the whole work, for if the form of the treatise as a whole is threefold, in this part it is twofold only, the division being that of the cantica and of the cantos. The first division, into canticae, cannot be applicable to the form of the part, since the cantica is itself a part under the first division. The title of the book is also clear, for the title of the whole book is Here Begins the Comedy, etc., as above, but the title of the part is Here Begins the third cantica of the Comedy of Dante, which is called Paradise. These 3 points in which the part differs from the whole having been examined, we may now turn our attention to the other 3, in respect of which there is no difference between the part and the whole. The author, then, of the whole and of the part is the person mentioned above, who is seen to be such throughout. The aim of the whole and of the part might be manifold, as, for instance, immediate and remote. But leaving aside any minute examination of this question, it may be stated briefly that the aim of the whole and of the part is to remove those living in this life from a state of misery, and to bring them to a state of happiness. The branch of philosophy to which the work is subject, in the whole as in the part, is that of morals or ethics, inasmuch as the whole as well as the part was conceived not for speculation, but with a practical object. For if in certain parts or passages the treatment is after the manner of speculative philosophy, that is, not for the sake of speculation, but for a practical purpose, since, as the philosopher says in the second book of the Metaphysics, practical men occasionally speculate on things in their particular and temporal relations. Having therefore premised these matters, we may now apply ourselves to the exposition of the literal meaning by way of sample, as to which it must first be understood that the exposition of the letter is in effect but a demonstration of the form of the work. The part in question then, that is, the third cantica, which is called Paradise, falls by its main division into 2 parts, namely the prologue and the executive part, which second part begins, Surge mortali per diverse foci. As regards the first part, It should be noted that although in common parlance it might be termed an exordium, yet, properly speaking, it can only be termed a prologue, as the philosopher seems to indicate in the 3rd book of his Rhetoric, where he says that the proem in a rhetorical oration answers to the prologue in poetry, and to the prelude in flute-playing. It must further be observed that this preamble, which may ordinarily be termed an exordium, is one thing in the hands of a poet and another in those of an orator, for orators are wont to give a forecast of what they are about to say in order to gain the attention of their hearers. Now poets not only do this, but in addition they make use of some sort of invocation afterwards. And this is fitting in their case, for they have need of invocation in a large measure, inasmuch as they have to petition the superior beings for something beyond the ordinary range of human powers, something almost in the nature of a divine gift. Therefore the present prologue is divided into 2 parts. In the first is given a forecast of what is to follow. In the second is an invocation to Apollo, which second part begins, O buono Apollo, all'ultimo lavoro, etc. With reference to the first part, it must be observed that to make a good exordium 3 things are requisite, as Tully says in his New Rhetoric, that the hearer, namely, should be rendered favorably disposed, attentive, and willing to learn, and this is especially needful in the case of a subject which is out of the common, as Tully himself remarks. Inasmuch then as the subject dealt with in the present work is out of the common, it is the aim of the first part of the exordium or prologue to bring about the above-mentioned 3 results with regard to this out-of-the-way subject. For the author declares that he will relate such things as he who beheld them in the first heaven was able to retain, in which statement all those 3 things are comprised. For the profitableness of what he is about to be told begets a favorable disposition in the hearer. Its being out of the common engages his attention, and its being within the range of possibility renders him willing to learn. Its profitableness he gives to be understood when he says that he shall tell of that which above all things excites the longing of mankind, namely the joys of paradise. Its uncommon nature is indicated when he promises to treat of such exalted and sublime matters as the conditions of the celestial kingdom. Its being within the range of possibility is demonstrated when he says that he will tell of those things which he was able to retain in his mind, for if he was able, so will others be also. All this is indicated in the passage where he declares that he had been in the first heaven, and that he purposes to relate concerning the celestial kingdom whatsoever he was able to store up, like a treasure, in his mind. Having thus noted the excellence and perfection of the first part of the prologue, we may now proceed to the literal exposition. He says then that the glory of the first mover, which is God, shines forth in every part of the universe, but in such wise that it shines in one part more and in another less, that it shines in every part, both reason and authority declare. Reason thus: everything which exists has its being either from itself or from some other thing. But it is plain that self-existence can be the attribute of one being only, namely the first or beginning, which is God, since to have being does not argue necessary self-existence, and necessary self-existence appertains to one being only, namely the first or beginning, which is the cause of all things. Therefore everything which exists, except that one itself, has its being from some other thing. If then we take, not anything whatsoever, but that thing which is the most remote in the universe, it is manifest that this has its being from something, and that from which it derives either has its being from itself or from something else. If from itself, then it is primal; if from something else, then that again must either be self-existent or derived from something else. But in this way we should go on to infinity in the chain of effective causes, as is shown in the 2nd book of the Metaphysics. So we must come to a primal existence, which is God. Hence, mediately or immediately, everything that exists has its being from him, because, inasmuch as the second cause has its effect from the first, its influence on what it acts upon is like that of a body, which receives and reflects a ray, since the first cause is the more effective cause. And this is stated in the book On Causes, namely, that every primary cause has influence in a greater degree on what it acts upon than any second cause. So much with regard to being. With regard to essence, I argue in this wise: every essence except the first is caused, otherwise there would be more than one necessarily self-existent being, which is impossible. For what is caused is the effect either of nature or of intellect, and what is of nature is consequently caused by intellect, inasmuch as nature is the work of intelligence. Everything, then, which is caused is the effect, mediately or immediately, of some intellect. Since, then, virtue follows the essence whose virtue it is, if the essence is of intellect, the virtue is wholly and solely of the intellectual essence to a first cause, in the case of being. So now we must do so in the case of essence and of virtue. Whence it is evident that every essence and every virtue proceeds from a primal one, and that the lower intelligences have their effect, as it were, from a radiating body, and, after the fashion of mirrors, reflect the rays of the higher to the one below them, which matter appears to be discussed clearly enough by Dionysius in his work on the Celestial Hierarchy, and therefore it is stated in the book On Causes that every intelligence is full of forms. Reason, then, as we have seen, demonstrates that the divine light, that is to say, the divine goodness, wisdom, and virtue, shines in every part. Authority likewise declares the same, but with more knowledge. For the Holy Spirit says by the mouth of Jeremiah, "Do not I fill heaven and earth?" And in the Psalm, "Whither shall I go from thy spirit? And whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I descend into hell, thou art there also. If I take my wings," etc. And Wisdom says, "The Spirit of the Lord hath filled the whole world." And Ecclesiasticus, in the 42nd chapter, "His work is full of the glory of the Lord," to which also the writings of the pagans bear witness, for Lucan says in his 9th book, "Jupiter is whatever thou seest, wherever thou goest." He says well, then, when he says that the divine ray, or divine glory, penetrates and shines through the universe. Penetrates as to essence, shines forth as to being. And what he adds as to more and less is manifestly true, since we see that one essence exists in a more excellent degree, and another in a less, as is clearly the case with regard to the heaven and the elements, the former being incorruptible, while the latter are corruptible. And having premised this truth, he next goes on to indicate paradise by a circumlocution, and says that he was in that heaven which receives the glory of God, or his light, in most bountiful measure. As to which it must be understood that this heaven is the highest heaven, which contains all the bodies of the universe, and is contained by none, within which all bodies move, itself remaining everlastingly at rest, and which receives virtue from no corporeal substance. And it is called the Empyrean, which is as much as to say, the heaven glowing with fire or heat. Not that there is material fire or heat therein, but spiritual, which is holy love or charity. Now that this heaven receives more of the divine light than any other can be proved by two things. First, by its containing all things, and being contained by none. Secondly, by its state of everlasting rest or peace. As to the first, the proof is as follows. The containing body stands in the same relation to the content in natural position as the formative does to the formable, as we are told in the 4th book of the Physics. But in the natural position of the whole universe, the first heaven is the heaven which contains all things. Consequently, it is related to all things as the formative to the formable, which is to be in the relation of cause to effect. And since every causative force is in the nature of a ray emanating from the first cause, which is God, it is manifest that the heaven, which is in the highest degree causative, receives most of the divine light. As to the second, the proof is this. Everything which has motion moves because of something which it has not, and which is the terminus of its motion. The heaven of the moon, for instance, moves because of some part of itself which has not attained the station towards which it is moving, and because no part whatsoever of it has attained any terminus whatsoever, as indeed it never can, it moves to another station, and thus is always in motion, and is never at rest, which is what it desires. And what I say of the heaven of the moon applies to all the other heavens except the first. Everything, then, which has motion is in some respect defective, and has not its whole being complete. That heaven, therefore, which is subject to no movement, in itself and in every part whatsoever of itself, has whatever it is capable of having in perfect measure, so that it has no need of motion for its perfection. And since every perfection is a ray of the primal one, inasmuch as he is perfection in the highest degree, it is manifest that the first heaven receives more than any other of the light of the primal one, which is God. This reasoning, however, has the appearance of an argument based on the denial of the antecedent, in that it is not a direct proof, and according to a syllogistic form. But if we consider its content, it is a good proof, because it deals with a thing eternal, and assumes it to be capable of being eternally defective. So that if God did not give that heaven motion, it is evident that he did not give it material in any respect defective. And on this supposition the argument holds good by reason of the content. In this form of argument is much the same as though we should reason, if he is man, he is able to laugh. For in every convertible proposition a like reasoning holds good by virtue of the content. Hence it is clear that when the author says, "In that heaven which receives more of the light of God," he intends by circumlocution to indicate paradise, or the heaven of the Empyrean. And in agreement with the foregoing is what the philosopher says in the first book, On Heaven, namely that a heaven has so much the more honorable material than those below it, as it is the further removed from terrestrial things. In addition to which might be adduced what the Apostle says to the Ephesians of Christ, who ascended up far above all heavens, that he might fill all things. This is the heaven of the delights of the Lord. Of which delights it is said by Ezekiel against Lucifer, "Thou, the seal of similitude, full of wisdom, beautiful in perfection, wast in the delights of the paradise of God." And after he has said that he was in that place of paradise which he describes by circumlocution, he goes on to say that he saw certain things which he who descends therefrom is powerless to relate, and he gives the reason, saying that the intellect plunges itself to such depth in its very longing, which is for God, that the memory cannot follow. For the understanding of which it must be noted that the human intellect in this life, by reason of its connaturality and affinity to the separate intellectual substance, when in exaltation, reaches such a height of exaltation that after its return to itself memory fails, since it has transcended the range of human faculty. And this is conveyed to us by the Apostle, where he says, addressing the Corinthians, "I know a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth, how that he was caught up to the third heaven, and heard unspeakable words, which it is not lawful for a man to utter." Behold, after the intellect had passed beyond the bounds of human faculty in its exaltation, it could not recall what took place outside of its range. This again is conveyed to us in Matthew, where we read that the first 3 disciples fell on their faces, and record nothing thereafter, as though memory had failed them. And in Ezekiel it is written, "And when I saw it, I fell upon my face." And should these not satisfy the cavillers, let them read Richard of St. Victor in his book On Contemplation. Let them read Bernard in his book On Consideration. Let them read Augustine in his book On the Capacity of the Soul, and they will cease from their cavilling. But if on account of the sinfulness of the speaker they should cry out against his claim to have reached such a height of exaltation, let them read Daniel, where they will find that even Nebuchadnezzar by divine permission beheld certain things as a warning to sinners, and straightway forgot them. For he, who maketh his sun to shine on the good and on the evil, sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust, sometimes in compassion for their conversion, sometimes in wrath for their chastisement, in greater or lesser measure, according as he wills, manifests his glory to evildoers, be they never so evil. He saw then, as he says, certain things which he who returns has neither knowledge nor power to relate. Now it must be carefully noted that he says, has neither knowledge nor power. Knowledge he has not, because he has forgotten. Power he has not, because even if he remembers and retains it thereafter, nevertheless speech fails him. For we perceive many things by the intellect, for which language has no terms, a fact which Plato indicates plainly enough in his books by employment of metaphors. For he perceived many things by the light of the intellect, which his everyday language was inadequate to express. Afterwards the author says that he will relate concerning the celestial kingdom such things as he was able to retain, and he says that this is the subject of his work, the nature and extent of which things will be shown in the executive part. Then when he says, O buono Apollo, etc., he makes his invocation. In this part is divided into 2 parts. In the first he invokes the deity, and makes a petition. In the second he inclines Apollo to the granting of his petition by the promise of a certain recompense, which second part begins, O divina virtu. The first part again is divided into 2 parts. In the first he prays for divine aid. In the second he adverts to the necessity for his petition, whereby he justifies it. In this part begins, Infino a qui l'un giogo di Parnaso, etc. This is the general meaning of the second part of the prologue. The particular meaning I shall not expound on the present occasion, for anxiety as to my domestic affairs presses so heavily upon me that I must perforce abandon this and other tasks of public utility. I trust, however, that your magnificence may afford me the opportunity to continue this useful exposition at some other time. With regard to the executive part of the work, which was divided after the same manner as the prologue taken as a whole, I shall say nothing either as to its divisions or its interpretation at present, save only that the process of the narrative will be by ascent from heaven to heaven, and that an account will be given of the blessed spirits who are met with in each sphere, in that their true blessedness consists in the apprehension of him who is the beginning of truth, as appears from what John says, "This is life eternal, to know thee, the true God," etc., and from what Boethius says in his third book on consolation, "To behold thee is the end." Hence it is that, in order to reveal the glory of the blessedness of those spirits, many things which have great profit and delight will be asked of them, as of those who behold the fullness of truth. And since, when the beginning or first, which is God, has been reached, there is naught to be sought for beyond, inasmuch as he is Alpha and Omega, that is, the beginning and the end, as the vision of John tells us, the work ends in God himself, who is blessed forevermore, world without end. End of chapter